committee will come to order. Without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. Today we'll hear from some of our best foreign policy minds on one of our most pressing foreign policy challenges, how to deal with an increasingly aggressive and belligerent Russia. Ambassador Newland, Ambassador Freed, General Kane, welcome to members of the public and press as well. If you look at a map of the world, you won't find too many places that Russia isn't stirring up trouble. On its own borders, Russia's illegal occupation of Georgia and Ukraine has shattered decades of work to build peace and stability in Europe. Propaganda efforts in cyber warfare across the continent have spread lies and confusion with the clear aim of undermining Western unity and the transatlantic alliance. Russia has weaponized its energy resources, expanding into European markets and creating greater and greater dependency, particularly with projects such as the Nord Stream 2 and Turk Stream. These are clear efforts to increase its influence with European countries and advance its political aims. In the Middle East, Russia has served as a lifeline for the murderous regime of Bashar al-Assad, aiding in the wholesale slaughter of innocent civilians. Russia has exported these same so-called counterterrorism tactics to sub-Saharan Africa, where, for example, in the Central African Republic, civilian casualties are mounting. As we watch events unfold here in our own neighborhood, we're reminded that Putin has sent troops to Venezuela to prop up the illegitimate dictator Nicolas Maduro. Here in the United States, of course, Russia put its thumb on the scale during the 2016 election to support President Trump's campaign, as Special Counsel Mueller's report puts it, and I quote, in sweeping and systematic fashion, unquote. And Russia continues to work to fuel political division and undermine American democracy. And the largest group victimized by Russia's harmful and destructive policies are Russians themselves, living under the tyranny of Vladimir Putin. Putin tries to silence his political opponents, honest journalists, and anyone else who dares to criticize his corrupt rule. His tools range from imprisonment to torture to assassination, as the world saw in the case of Boris Nemtsov, who I had the pleasure of meeting with right in this very building before he was brutally assassinated by Putin, his people. Putin and his thugs continue to tighten their grip on freedom of speech, expression, and access to information and economic opportunity. And let me add on that note that Russia continues to hold Paul Whelan, an American citizen, under false charges of espionage. Russia is denying him his basic human rights and has been dragging its feet every step of the way. I renew my demand that the Russian government end this charade and release Paul Whelan back to his family. What is Russia's aim with this unrelenting malevolence? What does Putin hope to accomplish by seizing territory, distorting reality, attacking democracy, and supporting tyranny? First, of course, the answer is power, both domestically and on the international stage. Putin and his henchmen in the Kremlin are desperate to keep their grip on power, whatever the cost. They need to hide the disaster that their oligarchy, kleptocracy, and corruption have been for their own country. Putin simply blames outside forces for Russia's troubles, but we all know the troubles of the Russian people are the result of Russia's corrupt leaders. Secondly, Russia wants to peddle the lie that there is a better alternative to democracy, a better alternative to the West. Putin wants a new Cold War, a new battle of ideas. He thinks he can win by supporting dictators and cozying up to the West's adversaries, including his recent attempts to reach out to China. He's wrong, of course, but that won't stop him from trying. It's a challenge we need to take seriously, and I don't think that the administration is doing nearly enough. We're being outplayed around the world and here on our home court. We're ceding ground in Syria and across the Middle East. We're letting Russia work its will in the European energy sector. And of course, with another presidential race gearing up, we haven't done nearly enough to shore up our own elections from Russian interference. The White House says no president has ever been tougher on Russia. I wish I could believe that. I've got to wonder why the administration won't meet the challenge head on. Special counsel said in his report that he couldn't establish criminal conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia. But let's be clear. We know the Russians offered the Trump campaign stolen information about Hillary Clinton. We know the Trump campaign was eager to receive it. We know there was contact after contact after contact between campaign officials and Russian officials, and we know that the president was working to expand his business interests in Russia right up to the election. The fact that such behavior is not illegal should be a call for Congress to act. And the fact is, we still don't know how deeply the president is involved with Putin. We have no idea what the president and Putin discussed at their meetings. We have no idea, and that underscores why this committee's oversight and investigative work will proceed full speed ahead, and why we will continue to shine a light on the real challenge that Russia poses. In fact, the ranking member and I are working on legislation to push back on Russian aggression, protect American interests, ramp up the targeted sanctions, and enhance diplomacy and counter propaganda efforts to meet the Russian threat. And I'm eager to hear our witnesses' thoughts on what we should be doing to counter Russia, both in the near and long term. I don't think there's any disagreement about that in this committee, of the members of this committee, and our witnesses. Before I introduce them, I will yield to our ranking member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for any opening remarks he might have.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As General Keane said, if a politician loses his voice, it's like losing a weapon. So I have sort of lost a little bit of my voice, but I'm going to try to get through this very briefly. Russia has been a threat for a long time. That's why NATO was formed. Russia did interfere with our elections. I was part of the 2016 Gang of Eight briefing on their attempt to meddle in our elections, and I've always stood firmly against that. I asked the prior administration to stand up against that publicly and condemn it, and I think we should still condemn it. I did a lot as chairman of Homeland Security to enhance our cyber security apparatus to protect Americans and the American electoral system. And I'm proud of that work. I don't think this is a partisan issue. As you and I had breakfast with the Secretary of State today, it's no question, no doubt in my mind, that Secretary Pompeo looks at Russia as a great threat to the United States. And one only need look at Ukraine and what they've done in Ukraine and in Crimea, and have been bold in their aggression. And now looking today at Venezuela, the fact that Russians are in our own hemisphere, posing a threat, putting military assets in our Western hemisphere, the likes of which we haven't seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The fact that President Maduro was on an airplane just yesterday to fly to Havana, and the Russians talked him out of it. What is going on in our hemisphere? They would love nothing more than poke us in the eye in our own hemisphere. They moved into Syria. They took over the ports in Syria. They saw a power grab because we did nothing. We did nothing in Syria. And inaction is a decision in and of itself, and the Russians exploited that. Mr. Chairman, as the Prime Minister of Turkey told us, that is precisely why the Russians are there, because we were not. We have to be a world leader. We can't lead from behind anymore. We have to be a leader. Otherwise, the Russians and the Chinese, for that matter, will fill that vacuum. So I commend you for having this hearing. There was no collusion in this last election, but did they try to meddle in the elections? Absolutely. And the intelligence shows that. The intelligence community shows that. There's no doubt in my mind. They are not our friend. And if anybody thinks Putin is our friend, they're wrong. I met with two Russian opposition leaders yesterday, and they view Putin as a threat to the world. And as, in my view, once KGB, always KGB. So I think this should not be a partisan exercise here. This should be an American people. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you. on issues related to this matter. And I hope we can pass legislation out of this committee, because I think I speak for most of my members on my side of the aisle that we don't view Russia as our friend. We're not complicit with Russia. Russia has been a Cold War enemy. They're an enemy of NATO, and they're an enemy of the United States today. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. I'm now pleased to introduce our witnesses. I'll start with Ambassador Victoria Nuland, who served as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs from September 2013 until January 2017 under President Obama and Secretary Kerry. She was State Department spokesperson during Secretary Hillary Clinton's tenure and U.S. Ambassador to NATO during President George W. Bush's second term from 2005 until 2008. Ambassador Nuland previously served as Special Envoy and Chief Negotiator on the Treaty on Conventional Arms Control in Europe, as Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Cheney, and in numerous overseas posts. She is now Senior Counselor at the Albright Stonebridge Group and holds positions at the Brookings Institution, Yale, and the National Endowment for Democracy. And she's also a personal friend of mine, and I'm always amazed at how smart she is and how hardworking and how much she knows. So welcome, Ambassador. Ambassador Daniel Fried was a member of the Foreign Service for 4 decades, serving as ambassador to Poland, as Assistant Secretary of State for Europe during the era of NATO enlargement, and as National Security Council Senior Director during the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations. He worked to craft the West's response to Moscow's aggression against Ukraine, starting in 2014 as the State Department's coordinator for sanctions policy. He is currently a distinguished fellow with the Atlantic Council and a visiting professor at Warsaw University, a hard worker, very competent, and we're very delighted that you're here, Ambassador. General Jack Keane served in the United States Army for 37 years, culminating with his appointment as Acting Chief of Staff and Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. He was a career infantry paratrooper, a decorated combat veteran of Vietnam, and commander of the 101st Airborne Division and the 18th Airborne Corps. After his 2003 retirement from the Army, General Keane spent a decade assisting senior defense officials in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's president of GSI Consulting and chairs the Institute for the Study of War and the Knollwood Foundation. And as I said, a very distinguished panel, very distinguished general. Welcome again to all of you. We're grateful for your time. I'll now recognize our witnesses for 5 minutes each to summarize their testimony, and we'll start with Ambassador Nuland.
Thank you, Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, members of this committee, for the opportunity to appear before you today. I commend this committee for the bipartisanship that it has shown on Russia-related legislation in recent years and for its continued commitment to that, as the ranking member made clear this morning. The first president for whom I served, Ronald Reagan, set the gold standard for policy leadership vis-a-vis the Kremlin. He understood that we in the United States had a dual mission: to contain, deter, and defeat dangerous and destabilizing behavior by the Kremlin, but also to offer Moscow a better, more collaborative relationship if it were willing to change course. Today, I believe our greatest challenge in countering a resurgent Russia is the lack of leadership, unity, and consistency in the United States in managing relations with Moscow. This, in turn, leaves our allies and partners adrift in confronting the many challenges from the Kremlin to our security, our democracy, and the liberal, rules-based order. It also leaves Moscow unsure what we value, and even more tempted to test the limits of U.S. and allied will to defend ourselves. Reagan in his day did not view Moscow as a permanent enemy, and nor should we today. The American people don't want that, and I don't believe the Russian people want it either. What we don't know, and what we have to continue to test, is whether Russian President Putin truly wants to improve relations. It may well be that his psychology and his leadership model are too dependent on an enemy abroad to change course. And we also have to steel ourselves for what may be a very long game that outlasts Putin. In the meantime, as the chairman and ranking member have made clear, none of us should have any illusions about the current challenge. Just a few highlights from the Kremlin's current playbook to set the table. Our democracy and those of our allies have been infected and undermined by Moscow's digital aggression. Russia's neighbors have been intimidated, invaded, and in the case of Crimea, Ukraine, annexed. Arms control agreements that kept the peace for decades have been violated. Thugs and dictators from Assad in Syria to Maduro in Venezuela survive and thrive thanks to Kremlin support. Moscow exports corruption and resorts to money laundering, criminality as tools of coercion. And the human and civil rights of Russia's own citizens have been trampled, and the innovation and talent of the country have been stifled. Today, Putin believes that the West is weak, that our political and economic systems are vulnerable, and that the values of tolerance, inclusion, and universal rights that we protect when we are at our best can be exploited to divide us. He aspires to lead a global club of autocrats who offer their citizens and the world an ideological and political alternative to the messiness and wonderfulness of free, open societies. We enable Putin's quest ourselves when our own leaders call into question the basic rights enshrined in our liberal constitution, an independent judiciary, a free press, protection of minority rights, and the oversight powers of this Congress. So I agree with the premise of the Trump administration's national security strategy that we have re-entered a period of competition with Russia. What I don't see, though, is a coherent, full government response to that challenge, which is led by the President in partnership with the Congress. To be effective, that strategy has to harness all the tools of our national power and those of our allies: military, political, economic, informational, and now, of course, digital. We have to harden our own defenses. We have to better expose and blunt Russian malign activity, and we have to increase the costs for Moscow, while also offering a path to de-escalation and even collaboration if the Kremlin changes course. And we have to coordinate all of this tightly with NATO, with the EU, with our Asian allies and partners, in order to amplify the impact of our actions, but also to close opportunities for Moscow to divide us. We have to once again remember how to marshal a big stick and a big carrot. And we should not forget to speak directly to the Russian people, who are now very tired of their government's focus on Ukraine and Syria and new weapons to the detriment of improved schools, hospitals, and jobs in Russia itself, and the corruption that is rotting that country. Let me just give two examples of how a larger strategy might work. To address Russia's digital assault on our democracy, here's what we need to do. We need to appoint a cyber czar in the White House to coordinate national and international policy. We need a national intelligence and operational fusion center, as has been called for in some legislation, to expose, defeat, and deter digital influence campaigns, electoral manipulation, and inauthentic speech, working closely with industry and with academia. We need an agreed escalation ladder of painful new economic sanctions, legal and regulatory penalties, coordinated with allies, ready to deploy when new malign influence is exposed. We can't wait until after the action has happened to start figuring out what the cost will be. And we need our own suite of reciprocal, legal, and when necessary, deniable digital and cyber countermeasures, which increase the cost to Putin vis-a-vis his own electorate and demonstrate his deficiencies at home. And for the carrot, we need a serious and standing, sustained dialogue with Moscow, which offers an armistice on these issues and sanctions relief and the prospect even of potentially collaborating to set global digital standards if and when the Kremlin verifiably renounces weaponization of the internet. Similarly, in the military sphere, where Russia's increasing reliance on nuclear weapons and investments in hypersonic, undersea, and cyber weapons present new threats, we should respond to Russian violations of the INF Treaty and its weapons buildup with new conventional deployments and missile defenses of our own in Europe, coordinated with our NATO allies. to deter nuclear first use and conventional adventurism, and to push the Russians back to the negotiating table. We need to maintain and strengthen NATO and U.S. defenses and exercises along the alliance's eastern edge and in the Baltic and Black Seas. And we need to appoint a senior negotiator and interagency team for comprehensive talks with Moscow on strategic stability, which tie any future arms control agreements and the extension of New START to a broader de-escalation of tensions and insecurity across all the military domains of power. And finally, we need to speak directly to the Russian people about the costs of Putin's militarization. They need to know where the wealth of their country has gone. These are just two areas of challenge with Russia. A comprehensive policy will require rigorous lines of effort also on Ukraine, on Syria, on corruption, and on all the other areas of concern. This level of effort will require principled, steady presidential leadership to unite our government, coordinate closely with all of you and the Congress, and to build the support of the American people and our allies. As our intelligence community and now the Mueller report make absolutely clear, Putin seeks to pit Americans against each other, to destroy our democratic system, to erode our trust in each other, and to damage our alliances. This is not about any one of us, nor is it about the president's legitimacy. It's about the safety and security of all of us and the future of the liberal world order that has served the United States so well for 70 years. Preserving these must be the first responsibility of any American president and of every Congress. We have the national strength and the allies to meet this challenge of a more dangerous Russia. What we have lacked is the resolve. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Nuland. Ambassador Fried.
Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, members of the committee, I also appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. The topic is relevant and timely, and for the record, I agree with my colleague and friend, Ambassador Nuland. President Trump once said that it would be nice if the U.S. got along with Russia. It would. But Presidents Bush and Obama tried and failed because neither would accept Putin's aggression abroad and repression at home. Putin's authoritarianism and kleptocracy keeps Russia backward. Reforms to develop Russia, rule of law, democracy, would end Putinism. Lacking democratic legitimacy and increasingly economic results, Putin seeks to assemble a counter-alliance of autocrats to support extremists to weaken the West and to counter the U.S. wherever possible. He wants to weaken the European Union and NATO and discredit democracy itself as an appealing alternative for Russians. Putin needs Ukraine to fail in its efforts to become a free market democracy closer to Europe, because a successful Ukraine would show Russians that Putinism is not the only way for them. A wise U.S. policy toward Russia, therefore, would combine resistance to Russian aggression, efforts to reduce the risks of destabilizing clashes and arms control when possible, without unwarranted concessions or apologies, cooperation with Russia where our interests overlap, maybe on the DPRK and spread of weapons of mass destruction without expecting too much too soon, and planning for potentially better relations with a better Russia. We should act in all of these things with our allies. The world's great and emerging democracies have the power and political legitimacy to maintain a rules-based system that favors freedom and advances our nation's interests and other nations' interests. Mr. Chairman, your invitation to this hearing requested recommendations to combat Russian coercion. So I offer the following. Strengthen NATO's eastern defenses. After the Cold War, the U.S. drew down its forces in Europe, and many European countries allowed their militaries to decline. I get it. We all wanted a peace dividend, and Russia appeared to be an emerging partner. But after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. and NATO changed course, deploying forces to the most vulnerable NATO members. Our allies stepped up. The British lead NATO forces in Estonia, the Canadians in Latvia, and the Germans in Lithuania. and the U.S. leads NATO's battalion in Poland and is stationed an armored brigade in Poland on a rotational basis. These deployments seek to deter, to show Russia that it cannot mount a sudden assault on NATO countries, conventional or hybrid, without triggering a wider conflict. The Obama administration deserves credit for leading NATO to make this shift, and the Trump administration deserves credit for continuing, even strengthening it. More needs to be done. That means strengthening NATO and U.S. capacity for rapid reinforcement through additional forces and military infrastructure in Europe. It means strengthening NATO and U.S. cyber defense and deterrent capacity now underway. The U.S. and Poland have launched discussions about increasing the U.S. military presence in that country. This is a worthy initiative, and the Poles seem willing to carry their share of the burden. I support putting in Poland a mix of rotational units, standing deployments, and permanent infrastructure integrated with NATO's defense plans. Second, defend against disinformation using democratic means. We need to combat Russian and others' disinformation while remaining true to our democratic values. As we learned in the Cold War, we need not become them in order to fight them. Here's an action plan. The U.S. government should support transparency and authenticity on social media, not heavy content control. This means disclosure of funders for politicals and issue ads, removing inauthentic and impersonator accounts, reassessing online anonymity. Angry Bob from Boise may in fact be Ivan from the St. Petersburg troll farm, and we shouldn't let Ivan get away with it. We should also deal with the algorithmic bias on social media companies toward sensational and extreme content. Legislation and regulation do have a place. The U.S. needs to get organized to fight disinformation. A lead agency or interagency body, such as a National Counter-Disinformation Center. We need to work with our friends. The EU is way ahead of the U.S. in addressing Russian disinformation. And we should consider a counter-disinformation coalition of like-minded governments, social media companies, and civil society groups to pool knowledge. Social resilience will work best in the long run. Teaching everyone from civil servants to children how to spot disinformation and manipulation ought to be standard practice. Third, we should employ the sanctions tool wisely. We're using sanctions a lot to deal with a lot of Russian misbehavior. There's a lot of Russian aggression around, but sorting out our options is a challenge. We need to decide what we're trying to achieve and with what priority. Do we want to use the threat of sanctions to push for a settlement in Ukraine, to deter Russia from interfering in next year's U.S. elections, to focus on Russian actions in support of Maduro? All of the above, equally? I suggest the following. Some sanctions options are available right now. We should be going after corrupt Russian oligarchs close to Putin. We should curtail channels for corrupt Russian funds and others corrupt funds, such as the use of non-transparent LLCs for high-end real estate deals. We should proceed with care on energy sanctions. We should if we escalate, we should go after future Russian production, not cause a spike in energy prices, giving the Kremlin a windfall. We should focus our best sanctions options on key goals. The Deter Act aims to prevent Russian election interference. Its focus is laudable, but we've got other objectives as well. I think we ought to save our best sanctions escalatory options for Ukraine-related and election-related. Get them ready, because if the Russians act, we need to be able to respond promptly, and the Russians need to know that we are prepared to act. We should also continue human rights-related sanctions, the Magnitsky Act and Global Magnitsky, key to actual abuses. Volume is less important than the right targets. We should work with allies and maintain operational flexibility. We need to be able to remove sanctions if Russian behavior improves. Licensing authority is not a loophole, it's a safety net. Two thoughts at the end. Sanctions work if they are embedded in a policy that makes sense. The administration needs to articulate a Russia policy and mean it. But there's more. A Russia policy should be linked to an American grand strategy that recognizes that a rules-based world that favors freedom is in our national interest. At our best, America has recognized that our interests and values advance together or not at all. Putin and like-minded nationalists and despots stand for nothing but power. We saw the results of such thinking in the first half of the 20th century. America can do better. In fact, after 1945 and again after 1989, we did do better. Despite our mistakes and inconsistencies, U.S. leadership generated the longest period of general great power peace in human history and unprecedented global prosperity. Our current problems are severe, some of our own making, but I hope and believe that we will recall the values and purposes which propelled U.S. world leadership and produced so much good for so many. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McCall, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you to discuss these issues and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador. General Keane.
Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me today to testify. I'm honored to be here with my esteemed colleagues, Ambassador Newland and Ambassador Fried. I want to thank the committee also for your leadership in establishing a broad bipartisan effort in the Congress in holding Russia accountable, particularly for a tough sanction regime. The United States and our allies are facing a resurgent Russia, to be sure, that desires to change the international order that has existed for 70-plus years, relitigate the end of the Cold War, return Russia to the world stage as a global power while challenging the American hegemon and increasing its own sphere of influence in a multipolar world. This sphere of influence, which is historically based, has grown rapidly in the last 2 decades to include Eastern Europe, the Middle East, South Asia, Latin and South America, Africa, and the Arctic. I spent over a year on the Bipartisan Congressional Commission on the National Defense Strategy, and we found the NDS accurately describes the strategic framework we are facing today, with a return to big power competition with Russia and China while confronting North Korea, Iran, and radical Islam. However, the Commission believes the execution of the NDS is less than satisfactory, and we are at considerable risk if we were to fight a conventional war with Russia or China today. The risk is driven by the harsh reality that United States military capability and dominance has seriously eroded. 9/11 wars, budget reductions, and sequestration have enabled Russia and China to close the technology advantage that we enjoyed. And in some capabilities, they actually exceed us. You asked for some recommendations, Mr. Chairman, and I'll mention a few, and certainly we can take on some more in Q&A. First, we need to develop a comprehensive strategy to deter, confront, and engage Russia. The strategy should include ways, means, and ends to counter the Russian challenge, particularly the doctrine of hybrid warfare, which includes influence operations, election meddling, etc. It should be publicly endorsed by the President of the United States, using a whole-of-government approach and developed in collaboration with our allies. That recommendation absolutely subsumes everything I'm about to say in terms of its criticality. The Russian hybrid war threat advantages doubt and confusion. Making a positive declaration statement puts Russia on notice. A suggested statement, quote, "The United States and NATO will regard the appearance of any Russian military forces, whether in uniform or out, and including private military companies, in any NATO member state as an attack defined by Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty and will come to the defense of the member states," unquote. Hybrid warfare is Russia's norm for applying force, influencing, and taking control. And the statement is just a step in the right direction in countering it. NATO, the world's most successful, enduring political and military alliance, which to date has prevented the calamity of another world war. NATO is an alliance that must be strengthened, as Ambassador Freed just mentioned, not just in terms of financial burden sharing, but in specific military capabilities from each member that directly contributes to deterrence. While there has been some improvement in forward deployed forces in Europe, it is inadequate for a credible defense. Remember what we have learned through the Cold War. To prevent a war, you have to be able to capably deter war. What is deterrence? Your adversary has to see the capability, and he has to know that you're willing to use it. While European forces need to be increased, it is essential that the United States deploy a corps-level joint and combined headquarters and a division headquarters with 2 armored brigades in addition to what we already have. This is not a return to the Cold War where we had 2 corps, 4 divisions, close to 400,000 troops. In Ukraine, Russia will try to manipulate the new inexperienced President Zelensky and hopefully not move him down the path of normalizing relations with Russia in order to get the Ukraine economy moving and to placate the oligarchs in getting Russian money. Europe and the United States must strongly engage Zelensky to support Ukraine's anti-corruption efforts and to strengthen their economic viability. And also, we need to help them add military capability. The Middle East, the United States should persist in renewing its leadership role in forming the Middle East Strategic Alliance, MESA, to counter Iran and reduce Russia's influence, publicize Russian atrocities in Syria and those it facilitates by the Assad regime in Iran, move diplomatically to reduce Russia's influence in Egypt and in Libya. And in Venezuela, Russia, who has made significant military and economic investments in Venezuela for years, is attempting to accomplish in the Western Hemisphere what so successfully they have done in the Middle East and Syria, to prop up a repressive regime which is an ally, and if successful, diminish U.S. influence in our own region. Russia, as part of its hybrid warfare doctrine in January, deployed 400 personnel from the Wagner Group, a private military firm that operates as a military unit. Their mission? Protect Maduro. Last month, Russia brought in actual military leaders and advisors to help with Venezuela's overall security. There is no doubt that these leaders are talking to Putin and his elites on a regular basis, and they are in control of Maduro. The reality is that I give the Trump team high marks so far in dealing with Venezuela. However, when Putin interfered militarily, and let's face it, he truly has, we should have responded not just with rhetoric, but with strong confrontation. What am I talking about? We should have told Putin that we're going to put increased lethal aid in his backyard in Ukraine. And a phone conversation with Vladimir should go like this: Vladimir, you put military intervention into the Western Hemisphere. I'm putting military aid into Ukraine. I'm not going to stop it until you get out of Venezuela. You moved in there secretly. You can get out secretly. I don't need to talk about it publicly. And also expose the fact that Putin, in violation of the UN resolutions that he supported, is providing economic assistance to North Korea on a regular basis. Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time, but I just want to mention two more recommendations. One, the most important issue for this committee is keeping the sanctions on Russia. They help to deprive Putin of the resources he needs to build his military to conduct major offensive operations, major conventional operations, excuse me. They also help with his hybrid warfare threat to deprive Putin of the resources to buy influence in other countries. So continue to sanction additional oligarchs and entities involved in illegal activities. On human rights, one of the best pressure tools available given Russia's obvious and continued pushback on him. The President should speak to this issue personally and hold Putin accountable. Reagan demonstrated that personal diplomacy with Gorbachev was still effective despite Reagan's identification of the Soviet Union's human rights abuses. In conclusion, countering Russian aggression requires steadfast American leadership in collaboration with our allies to establish a credible deterrence to war, the courage to confront aggression, and the openness to continue to engage Russia on issues of mutual benefit and concern. Certainly, nuclear disarmament is at the top of that list. Despite the progress made in countering Russia, there is much more work to be done, particularly in developing a comprehensive strategy to counter the Russian advance. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Minority McCall, I thank you for permitting me to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, brought your own cheering section. Thank you very much. While I know that my colleagues in the Senate are at this moment questioning Attorney General Barr about the Mueller report and Russia's interference in our own elections, I'm concerned about the relationship between the President and Vladimir Putin and what that means for our foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia. So, Ms. Nuland, in your statement, you noted that our greatest challenge in countering a resurgent Russia is the lack of leadership, unity, and consistency in the United States in managing relations with Moscow. So I'd like to ask the witnesses to address how President Trump's leadership on a series of issues have, I believe, undermined our response to Russia. First of all, I'm concerned that President Trump's stated plan to withdraw from Syria essentially cede the ground to Russia and other nefarious actors, such as Turkey. And rewarding Putin's military intervention in Syria appears to have only emboldened him to act in Venezuela, as we saw yesterday. So let me ask, starting with Ms. Nuland, how concerned are you that Putin feels free to intervene in a growing list of countries?
Chairman, I agree with you, and as I said in my statement, when we are unclear, when we are not strongly led from the presidential level, that's the time for adventurism by Moscow. We've seen that in past decades, and we see it now. So I think and I don't think that this began with President Trump. I think we have been ambivalent about our leadership role for some time, including in Syria. But there have also been enormous opportunities missed by this administration. I will start, as you did, with Syria. When the administration redoubled force to clean out ISIS in Raqqa, that would have been the moment to redouble diplomatic pressure on Russia for a lasting settlement that would have kept Iran out and given the Syrian people an opportunity to choose their own path, and we squandered that. Similarly, with regard to Ukraine, we had an opportunity when Russia moved in the Azov Sea to put passive naval monitors into that sea and protect the entire littoral from the Azov into the Black Sea and into the Med, and we missed that opportunity. With regard to disinformation, Putin has understood that he presented the greatest national security challenge to U.S. freedom and democracy, perhaps since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we are in Kuwait and unclear in the way we are responding. And the statements by the president have all been about the linkages to his own legitimacy rather than the threat to U.S. national security. I would hope that the lesson from the Mueller report will be that it's time to turn the page and protect America now.
Thank you. Secondly, President Trump seems to find common cause with certain autocrats, right-wing autocrats in Europe, people like Viktor Orban of Hungary, who frequently supports Russia and serves as Putin's Trojan horse in Europe. And this extends to Turkey, as I mentioned before, where we must not accede to President Erdogan's purchase of the Russian S-400 missile system, which would be disastrous for U.S.-Turkey ties. The The procurement is of grave concern because it would undermine NATO interoperability and potentially give Russia critical technical insights into the F-35 fighter, which Turkey helps build and is planning to operate. It would also likely trigger sanctions against Turkey under Section 231 of CATSA. We've made a last deal effort to convince Turkey to cancel the deal, offering the Patriot missile system instead. Let me ask, what other levers can the United States use to show Turkey that it is headed down the wrong path, that cozying up to Putin is a grave mistake? If anyone would like to answer that one.
Well, I certainly agree that Turkey acquiring an S-400, the most advanced air defense missile system in the world, is certainly contrary to our national interests, and particularly given the fact that I think you recognize that Turkey is part of a multinational group that is actually manufacturing the F-35, and you put them two together, and clearly Russian technicians and intelligence personnel would have access to the stealth technology that the F-35 represents as a major U.S. penetrator. So clearly we have to push back on this and push back on it strongly. I also want to say something that you mentioned before, Mr. Chairman, about Syria. Russia saw the opportunity in Syria because we were not taking any consequential action to do anything about it, frankly. We had abandoned Mubarak as a result of the Arab Spring in 2010. We pulled out of Iraq in 2011. We had a leader elected to replace Gaddafi, and all he wanted was some help to put down the militias that helped to overthrow Gaddafi, knowing they would overthrow him, and we refused him. As a result of that, Putin correctly assumed that the United States' normal leadership role in the Middle East had largely been abandoned, and he moved into Syria, conducted a tactical operational move with huge strategic implications for it. Every Arab country is now doing arms deals with him. He's proliferating the building of nuclear power stations in the Middle East as well. And I believe our policy is uneven in this response. Certainly the issue over Syria was not handled very well. We had made a commitment to stay in Syria, I think, for two reasons. Stated purpose was dealing with ISIS and make certain it doesn't reemerge. And certainly to counter the Iranians' influence in Syria, which is encroaching on Israel. And to suggest that we would just summarily pull out of Syria and abandon those two goals clearly were not in U.S. national interest. Fortunately, the President listened to advisors and was able to readdress that decision, and at least for the time being, we're remaining there. But the unevenness of the policy, I think, creates doubt in the minds of our allies and also in the minds of our adversaries about the United States' determination to provide a leadership role in the Middle East, which I think is critical to U.S. national interests.
Thank you, General. I absolutely agree with your statement. I think you hit it right on the head. Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we both agree on Syria. And I think Turkey, a NATO ally, buying Russian S-400s is so contrary to the NATO doctrine. I go back to Reagan, the ambassador you talked about, Churchill, Kennedy. Weakness invites aggression. If we leave a power vacuum in the world and we don't lead, others will lead and they will follow. And that's kind of the primary premise. I think that's a problem in Syria. I think it's a problem with Turkey. Reagan had deterrence. And that's why Gorbachev and Yeltsin came to the table and we had perestroika. And we were able to actually have a conversation with Russia. Putin is a very different animal. It's a very different profile. I think he views And if I had to have a behavioral scientist, he would say, or she, that he views them as traitors to his country, that they betrayed the glory of the old Soviet empire. So my question is, I mean, how do you deal, and I could talk about cyber forever and the cyber attacks going on. How do you deal with a personality, and that's what we're dealing with, who's leading his country, I think, in the wrong direction? But how do you sit down and do what Reagan did with Gorbachev and Yeltsin when you're dealing with a mindset that goes back to the KGB, and he wants to become Stalin-esque? I think it's very, very difficult. And then, General Keane, I have one question for you after that, but if I could ask the panel that question. Yes.
Mr. McCall, I agree that Putin is leading Russia in a bad direction. Bad for us, bad for Russia's neighbors, but also bad for Russia and the Russian people. Russian history suggests that authoritarianism at home goes along with aggression abroad, and that Russia turns to reform and modernization at home usually when their foreign aggression fails. That's not a precise rule, but the best way to get to a better Russia is to counter the aggressive Russia we now see. Gorbachev had to turn inward toward reforms because Brezhnev's aggression in Afghanistan and elsewhere around the world was seen to be failing. And then we had the most hopeful period we've had since before World War II. Yeah. Because Reagan was able to resist Soviet Union's aggression abroad, we were able then to turn and help a genuine reformist Soviet leader. Now, it didn't turn out as we hoped, but the general pattern is there. I don't believe that Russia is destined by virtue of its history to be our adversary forever. It is now, but we can get to a better Russia if we're realistic about the Russia we've got now. We should not do dirty deals with Putin, sell out Ukraine, recognize a sphere of influence, none of that. We should be true to our values and confident that if we are, we raise the odds of a better Russia we can deal with. And we shouldn't rule out that possibility. I think your question is right.
Thank you.
I would agree 100% with that. I would simply add that Reagan also made Kremlin adventurism extremely expensive, whether it was having to match our own deterrence and arms buildup, whether it was playing directly to the Russian people about the human rights abuses and failures of their own country, thereby stirring up an appetite for change, or, as Ambassador Fried said, supporting those countries that faced Russian aggression strongly. I have had, looking for the verb, the privilege of being in the room with President Putin 5 or 6 times over the period of 2015-16 on U.S. delegations. He is a highly transactional player. And the entire conversation is usually about what it's going to cost me and my friends if I don't work with you, and how serious are you about the opportunity. So this is a relationship that needs to be fought for from a position of extreme strength and collaboration with our allies, but also with a clear path forward.
So, General Keane, you mentioned Russia in our hemisphere. I don't think we've seen anything like this since the Cuban Missile Crisis you mentioned. They have defense systems in Venezuela. They, by all accounts, and we talked to the Secretary this morning, stopped Maduro on the tarmac from leaving Venezuela to go to Havana because it's in their best interest to have Maduro in power. What is your take on that? I'm very interested in your policy response to that, and that is the transactional nature, Ambassador Noonan, you mentioned, and that is if you do this, if you go forward in the Western Hemisphere what I worry about is they're going to say, Maduro, we're going to prop you up if you give us the military port in Caracas, strategic military port in Caracas. Your response is we're going to put more lethal aid in Ukraine.
Yes, I mean, this is a serious strategic issue that's taking place here. The framework for it is certainly Russia, China, and Iran, Turkey to a lesser degree, are supporting communist and socialist regimes that are not in the interest of the United States, and that is Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. This administration, I believe, has taken an action to push back on that, and I applaud them for doing it, not just dealing with Venezuela, but recognizing what the strategic framework truly is. In reference, Putin and China have both made significant investments in Venezuela for their own self and national interests, and they're about protecting that. But for Putin, it's much more than that. This is a strategic move on his part into the Western Hemisphere, no less than his strategic move into the Middle East and using Syria as the vehicle of opportunity. And that is what he sees here. And he is using the same doctrine, in a sense, to do that. In the Middle East, he brought in a modest amount of military capability to achieve a strategic goal because the Arabs all saw Russia standing up behind an ally in the region at the expense of the United States, who had failed to do that on a number of occasions just prior to that, and also failed to stand up significantly for the Syrian moderate opposition forces, which wanted to overthrow the Assad regime. So that was a clarion call there. And the benefit he achieved out of that has encouraged him to take this other step in the Western Hemisphere. So make no mistake about it, even though he's using hybrid warfare, 400 military personnel, the Wagner Group, by the way, that's the same group that was in eastern Ukraine. That's the same group that we killed a couple hundred of in Syria. That's the same group that is in Africa. He brought them in here for one reason only, to successfully prop up this regime. And then he brought his advisors in here. And he's got highly qualified military and political advisors who are shoring up the Maduro regime. So when the Secretary of State says on national television, international television, I would suggest, that Maduro is about to leave and Russia is calling the shots, about the same time Russia was having a national security meeting, is our words for it. You know that Putin was told by his advisors that he's talking to on a regular basis what the actions were, and he's telling them, hold them, even if you have to do them at gunpoint. Don't let him get out of there. And when Ambassador Bolton is talking about the three leaders, which was quite unprecedented to see, the National Security Advisor of the United States on international television calling out the defense minister, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the head of the Presidential Guard for not complying with the weeks of effort that the United States diplomats had put into getting them to turn against Maduro, and calling them out for failure to do that is really quite extraordinary. While the Cubans have 20,000 goons in that country conducting paramilitary operations and killing the Venezuelan people, it is Putin who is impacting on the political control of that regime for their own national self-interest. And the stakes are high because this is the Western Hemisphere.
Thank you, General. Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. I'll pick up on what Ambassador Nuland said, that we've got to make adventurism expensive. And the greatest adventurism of this administration, of the Putin administration, was not to tamper with the territorial integrity or sovereignty of Georgia or Ukraine, but rather and boldly to tamper with the democracy and the sovereignty of the United States. The U.S. intelligence community has said unambiguously that the Russian Russian Federation interfered with the 2016 presidential election. And so far, our only response, the only pushback we've had is we've identified a few Russian individuals who won't be able to visit Disneyland. They won't get visas. That's it. And so which of the witnesses would agree that we should, in response to their interference with our sovereignty, prohibit U.S. persons from buying Russian sovereign debt? I just need a yes, no. I only have time for a yes, no. I say a yes from General Keane, a yes from Ambassador Fried, and a yes from Ambassador Newland. Sounds like a good bill. General, I'm sure that it's never a good military strategy to only have a defense and not have an offense. Should it be the policy of the United States to use our intel resources to discover, document, and publish the private communications of Putin, his government, and the oligarchs around him for the purpose of showing to the Russian people their theft, their crime, and their corruption? Again, I'll ask for yes, no answers. Ambassador Newland.
As I said in my statement, I don't know if I would phrase it exactly the way you did or speak in public about precisely what we would do, but certainly Putin's greatest vulnerability at home is...
Since we've done nothing yet, Congress would have to establish our policy. We don't have a secret way to do that.
Well, Congress has been doing a good job holding the line on policy. We commend you. My point would simply be that I think that we need to make sure the Russian people understand that they are being ripped off by their own government.
We have done nothing to accomplish that goal with the executive branch making the decisions. So either the Congress requires that by statute, and there's no secret way to do it, or we continue the policy of having a dozen people not able to visit Disneyland. Ambassador Fried.
I think one of the best pieces of the CATSA sanctions legislation was the Congress's demand for a report of Putin's power structure. And it was called the Kremlin Report, identifying those cronies close to Putin. That really rattled Moscow.
But not nearly as rattled as they were by the Panama Papers. And if we can show pictures to the Russian people of the theft that has gone on, we can do a lot. I want to move on to another question, and it's really a question for all my colleagues here, because we're all part of political organizations. We saw in the last election that a foreign hostile power was able to obtain allies in the United States to provide information that was used. In this case, the NRCC took the information stolen by the Russians and made use of it in their campaign materials. And so I would hope each of us, for the record, would answer the question, will we, for our own campaigns, for organizations that we support, insist that campaigns not make use of material stolen by hostile adversaries? I'll ask everyone to respond to the record for that, since I can't get answers from my colleagues. But if this committee cannot set the example and say, we do not want to benefit from the theft of information by foreign adversaries, then we're going to have a tough time. General Keane, you were with IP3. That is viewed as a spin-off of ACU, which was trying to get the Saudis to buy both Russian and American nuclear programs or power plants. Should we support selling Soviet reactors to, or Russian reactors to, Saudi Arabia? And I don't know if you have or not.
No, that's not an accurate characterization, but I got involved with IP3 simply, as with 3 other foreign national security experts, simply for one reason, because the Middle East was going to go nuclear with 40 nuclear power plants, and Russia and China was going after that.
General, should we
Let
draw
me-
the line and tell the Saudis?
Absolutely.
No nuclear weapons, no nuclear program
not.
without adequate safeguards.
The-
We
the
drew the line
inaccurate-
for Iran,
Of
and we
course
told them
not.
they couldn't.
Why
Why
what I'm
not?
trying to say, Mr. Congressman, we got involved in this to prevent that from happening. We got involved in it because we didn't want any nuclear proliferation, and we got involved in it because we knew they would not know how to secure it. There
So
is
would you support
there is
turning to
no
the-
industry that is more regulated than this. The 1, 2, 3
General, I'm going to
agreement
reclaim my
is-
time and ask you, should we insist that before Saudi Arabia goes with nuclear power plants, that they sign the additional protocol, agree to the gold standard limitations, and make sure that they are not using it as a front for developing
Absolutely.
nuclear weapons?
There's no doubt the United States policy and everybody I know who is supporting it, whether it's Saudi Arabia or any other country in the world, they have to sign a 1, 2, 3 agreement. The government has to before any commercial entity can work with them to establish nuclear power, not nuclear weapons, because we don't want that proliferation. And Congress has oversight of the 1, 2, 3. You're going to have a say about it.
Our say on 1, 2, 3 agreements is too weak, and we have legislation to make that say stronger, but my time has gone on, and I agree with you. We need tough controls. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony and for your leadership, each and every one of you. Let me just ask Ambassador Nuland, hindsight is 2020, and I think you made a very powerful statement about how Ronald Reagan set the gold standard for policy leadership vis-a-vis the Kremlin, and I agree with that. But frankly, I lived through that. I've been on this committee since 1983. I got elected in 1981. 1980, took office in 81. And Ronald Reagan was branded a warmonger when he responded to the Soviet Union's aggression and buildup with Pershing II missiles and with cruise missiles. He was branded a warmonger. And I sat on this committee, and we had one debate after another. And yet, hindsight, looking back, peace through strength made a huge difference in terms of outcome. Even when he walked away from Reykjavik, he was branded by especially members of the U.S. Senate in a very, very pejorative, in a very negative way by those individuals. Even when I traveled to the Soviet Union on my first trip on human rights on behalf of Soviet Jews, 1982 in January, the delegation members kept mocking Ronald Reagan in the presence of Kremlin leaders, saying, "Don't worry, he'll be gone in 1984. He's a grade B actor, and then you can work with people that will work with you." So, I do think that Donald Trump needs space. Now that the Mueller report has said there was no collusion, he needs more space, I think, within to operate and to be strong. And of course, what's happening in Venezuela is another clear example of a manifestation of Russian power. We saw it during the Reagan years with the FMLN and the Sandinistas operating through Cuba again. And again, that was branded as very negative as well. So my hope is that there will be more space for the president to act decisively on behalf of American and Western interests. And you even said, Ambassador Nuland, that we need to respond to INF treaty violations with advanced conventional deployments, and I agree with you. Peace through strength is the only way we're going to get from here to there. Let me also ask you, if you could, all of you, Poland has come forward, and Ambassador Fried, you made mention of this, called it a worthy initiative they've offered to put up $2 billion for a permanent base there as a deterrent, and as you pointed out, the purpose of deployments is deterrence, and I think that buys a tremendous amount of deterrence. And I've met with President Duda and others. They are very serious, and again, they're willing to put up real money. You might want to speak to that as very, very important. Let me also say that when it comes to Africa, and General, thank you for again bringing up the Wagner Group. Just yesterday, we had a hearing with Karen Bass in our subcommittee on CAR. And we know the Wagner Group is very active in CAR. They're facilitating the fleecing of that country of very precious metals. And of course, they're bypassing the arms embargo imposed upon CAR. And the Russians are the ones that are bypassing it. And the UN peacekeepers are not doing, I believe, a good job in trying to stop that. Equally important is that Russia, since sanctions were rightfully imposed after the annexation of the Crimea in 2014. 19 have signed on with Russia for agreements. Most recently, Burundi, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Madagascar now have cooperation agreements for weapons and training. So again, the Russians are very, in a nefarious way, spreading their tentacles like the Chinese are doing throughout Africa and the world. And we're seeing it, of course. So we have a mega threat with Russia. That said, and one final comment, we do have to find places of cooperation, as you said, Pastor Newland, in the area of carrots. One carrot that I think we need to use now and aggressively is to work with them on mitigating the scourge of human trafficking. I'm the prime author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, and after that was enacted, President Bush II, went ahead and did some great work with the FSB in trying to combat the buying and selling and the commodification of Russian women who are being sold in New York, being sold in northern New Jersey, all over the country, especially being sold in Russia. So my hope would be that that would be an area where we could work in a cooperative way to protect those Russian women who are being so cruelly exploited. It would be a carrot, Ambassador. So any comments, please?
I'm glad you brought up Africa because Russia clearly is moving rapidly into Africa. They're interested in strategic bases in the Med in Libya, also at the Red Sea in Eritrea and Sudan. They're expanding their military influence across Africa with security agreements, with arms sales, and with training programs. You mentioned the Central African Republic, also in Libya, Egypt, Algeria, and the Sub-Saharan. And they're also seeking new economic markets and energy resources. And Russia has major oil and gas interests in Algeria, Angola, Egypt, Libya, Senegal, South Africa, Uganda, and Nigeria. There is no doubt that they see Africa clearly as a sphere of influence for them, much as China does. Our commitment to Africa is very modest, to say the least. We have about 1,000 civilians working there and about 6,000 military there. And obviously, the State Department has the lead on Africa, but it's something we truly have to look at to see if our resources that we're applying is in our interest, given the geopolitical interest that China and Russia both have in Africa.
Thank you very much. Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. Hi to all ambassadors in general. You know, sometimes it seems funny, Mr. Chairman, anytime we're talking about Russia on the other side, you know, I look and say, where's Dana Rohrabacher?
I think he used to sit in your seat, Mr. Meeks.
But and the reason why I say that is just, you know, sitting here and I was listening to some of the testimony in my office, actually, and thinking through my time here in Congress. And when I first came in, my thought was Russia was a big, growing country. We were post the Cold War. Things should change. You know, we were more interdependent now with other countries around the world. And, you know, we were looking to talk about getting rid of Jackson Vanik so that we could have a better relationship. And, you know, things seemed to be moving a little bit better at that time. And then, actually, former President Barack Obama had an open mic talking to Medvedev, and he says, after the election, you know, we'll talk a little bit more. And then, you know, we end up starting with the Obama administration where we are now. So it seems to me that when it comes to countering Russia, it's difficult to prioritize where we should direct most of our efforts because in some instances it appears as though Russia is taking the shotgun approach to foreign policy, that they're shooting out anything that they can do that basically to undermine the United States and its allies, and it seems to, you know, and they try to see what sticks. They just throw something out against us and see what might stick against the war. Other times, however, it seems like Russia is operating with a coherent strategy that is being directed from the top. So I'll start with Ambassador Newland. In your opinion, does Russia have a coherent strategy for achieving its foreign policy goals, and does it have a specific end game that it is trying to reach? What's your thoughts on that?
I think President Putin initially, as he said in 2005, sought to restore the glory and spheres of influence of the Soviet Union. But now his appetite has grown with the eating, and as I said in my testimony, he believes we are weak and he can exploit our divisions. He believes we did not respond with the kind of strength he would have expected, whether it was in Syria or Ukraine or against the INF Treaty violations or now in Venezuela. And therefore, as you said, he will take any target of opportunity to exploit and accrete into those spaces where we are not, whether it's undercutting democratic development in the Balkans, an area that the chairman and I have worked on a lot together with corruption and those kinds of things, whether it's allying with China on digital aggression and other things. So I think he has a very coherent strategy. He wants to make the world safe for autocracy and not just safe for it, but to make that an alternative governance model, and he wants to do that in part to stay at power at home because he's not offering his own people better schools or better hospitals or a better economy. He has to only offer them this illusion of glory. So it's both a defensive and an offensive strategy for him, but he's not 1,000 feet tall. You know, Russia has a GDP the size of Italy and 3 times the population and 5 times the landmass. We just don't have our act together, and we need to get our act together and be stronger at home, stronger with our allies, and roll it back. And I think we can, and give the Russian people another set of choices and call them to question whether they are actually living better in this system that he's offered.
Ambassador Fried?
I agree with what Ambassador Newland said, and I'd like to build on it. Putin is an opportunist, and his theory of autocrats can make progress because we've pulled ourselves out of the game. We need to remember that our strength was derived from our association and leadership of the free world. That is, we understood that values and interests ultimately were the same. That was our big strategic breakthrough decades ago. And we need to remember this, because when we're spending, the Trump administration is right that we've re-entered a period of great power rivalry. But then, for God's sakes, let's align ourselves with our friends, the better to deal with our adversaries. We waste too much political capital in ideological fights with the European Union. Look, the European Union can be a headache, but they're not our problem. They're not a strategic rival. We need to align ourselves with our friends on behalf of our values. And when we start doing that, we can push back most effectively against Putinism. Because as Ambassador Newland said, he offers power and not betterment of his own people. And we won the Cold War when it became clear that the Soviet Union offered nothing but chaos and poverty, and that to its own people. And we need to get back that vision of ourselves.
Thank you. I'm out of time.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you for being here today. Ambassador Fried, with your background, having been ambassador to Poland, could you, the question that Congressman Smith had proposed relative to our association with that NATO ally, can you expound on this?
Happily, I spent many years in Poland. The Trump administration is right to be talking with the Poles about increasing the U.S. military presence there. It's not just a bilateral deal. We need to do this within the NATO framework, and the Poles understand this. And this is, I should add that this is bipartisan in Poland. The government supports it. It's a conservative government. The liberal opposition supports it. I've asked them. This is the right thing to do. And it needs to be taken out of, it needs to be put, our military presence in Poland needs to be put in a context of a united West, NATO, the US and the EU, standing for our values of democracy and defending NATO allies. This is the right thing to do. I appreciate what the Trump administration is doing. I think they ought to, I hope they close a deal. I really do.
Thank you very much. And Ambassador Newland and General Keane, in line with Congressman Meeks, the interference of strategy of Russia to interfere in elections, with the most recent elections in Ukraine, what is your assessment of the interference, and did it have an outcome? Ambassador Newland.
Well, interestingly, in the latest Ukrainian elections, the Russians had almost no influence. They didn't have a candidate. As you saw, the outsider won an overwhelming majority all across the country, in part because the citizenry doesn't think that there's been enough change in the anti-corruption side and saw the other candidates as representatives of the old guard. So it's interesting to watch Moscow unsure how to work with President-elect Zelensky. I think we need to offer Ukraine strong support and get in there with Zelensky when he sits and encourage further reform, particularly on the anti-corruption side, and continue to tie our assistance to Ukraine to positive development there. The greatest nightmare for Russia is a successful Ukraine, because then they will have a neighbor at their door that is democratic, and not to mention the example that Ukraine sets with democratic alternation of power that could not be manipulated from the presidency. That's something Russia hasn't seen in a long time.
Thank you, General.
Yes, dealing with Ukraine, I really think Putin has sort of got a wait-and-see attitude with it. I mean, obviously he's directly involved, but he's also exercising some patience, because I think he fundamentally believes, given the problems that Poroshenko had in this election, so resoundingly defeated, you know, the domestic reforms were never really put in place. He's tied to corruption himself personally. And now we have someone with no political experience whatsoever who's running the country. While that may not have been Putin's choice, I think he looks at it very favorably. And if the government cannot really produce a degree of political stability and also a degree of economic viability and prosperity, Putin, it's on his side. He'd be able to wait this thing out and achieve what his national interests are. I firmly believe that we've got to be more involved than what we currently are in terms of politically, diplomatically, and also militarily, in terms of helping their military forces. So yes, and in terms of our own election, I'll take it at face value. It didn't impact on the election, but I don't believe that that's the only goal that Putin has when he's meddling in elections in France and Brexit in the United States and in other countries. He's really seeking to undermine the democratic and political process. And given what happened in our country with investigations that are still going on as the Congress is meeting today, and the significant political divisions that we have in our country as a result of his meddling, he probably thinks that's a major victory for himself and encourages him to do even more of it.
And thank each of you for your being here today and your insight, and we appreciate your service to our country.
Thank you. Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to underscore your comments in terms of the outrage of holding Paul Whelan for no legal reasons whatsoever in Russia. And also, I just want to comment briefly, I find it extraordinary that the top-line message of all of our witnesses today is that we're absent the resolve as a country right now in having a consistent Russia policy. I think that's something that's so obvious by your testimony, but really has to be highlighted. We have to do better than this as a country. Now, let me probe a little more deeply in things you touched upon. Could you tell us, any of you, that the relationship you've seen with, like, Deutsche Bank, dealing with the oligarchs and that relationship, anything you might want to comment about that kind of financial relationship with really the power brokers of Russia, the oligarchs, plus if you comment on Putin's use of the VEB bank.
In my last job in government, I was the State Department sanctions coordinator, so I got into some of these issues. We've seen, there's plenty of evidence that the Russians and Putin uses the Western financial system to launder money and park it. They take advantage of our system because they trust our banking system more than they trust their own. We should start drawing up the channels for potentially corrupt Russian money flows. For example, why should high-end real estate deals be allowed to exist without full disclosure of the beneficial owner? That means that Russian secret money can flow into New York or Miami or London or various places in Europe without any kind of oversight.
And we can do something stronger than what
Sure.
we're doing now to influence that. Make sure, for instance, there's compliance with our request for banks like this that might be conducting themselves this way right now.
Well, I also believe that there are regulatory and legislative changes that could mandate disclosure of beneficial owners in high-end real estate deals.
You also, what message, the VE Bank, is it safe to say, fair to say, that's Putin's bank, basically? That he has enormous influence. Is that fair to say, fair statement? What message are we getting when past and current members of the Trump administration or campaign are meeting with the head of that bank in secret meetings? What message does that send back to Russia?
In general, and without getting into the specifics, I think it is good to send the Russians a message that we don't appreciate what they're doing, and passing that message also to the heads of the big state Russian banks.
Okay, I just want to shift gears too. We have something that Russia doesn't have, for that matter, China, but we have a coalition. So in my subcommittee of this committee, I'm going to have a laser-like view on strengthening that coalition. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Europe, met with our officials, and happy to report that the strength we have together with NATO is still vibrant. It's still formidable. It's obviously important. But there's no mistaking that Russia is using significant resources in Central Europe and the Balkans to extend their influence. And yet, they seem to have these relationships with Viktor Orban and Hungary, with Erdogan and Turkey, which is a great concern, and even influence in Serbia. That's something that, if you could spend the rest of my time just commenting on briefly, because I think that's a concern. We want to keep this strong, and they're trying to divide us.
We need, with respect to Central Europe, we need to be active and present. I don't like a lot of what Viktor Orban has said about the Russians, but I don't regard Hungary as a lost cause. I think we need to show up. I think we need to be present in that space. I think that the Russian aggression has spoiled their relations with even some of their more traditional friends.
Ambassador Nuland, I'm sorry, I'm running out of time, but I'd like to I welcome anything you have to say in that regard.
Thanks, Congressman Keating. As you and I have discussed privately, we know a lot about Russian money sloshing around Eastern Europe and the Balkans. We know a lot about its corrupting influence. I think it's time to shine a light on that and expose those who take it and expose the Kremlin's use of the Russian taxpayers' money for malign purposes.
Great. Thank you. My time is up, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the panel. We're privileged to have folks of your breadth and scope of knowledge. I want to start out with a basic premise just to see if I can set the table and then go through some rhetorical questions to set up a question here. To me, contrary to popular belief, Russia really doesn't have a particular preference of which party in the United States. Their goal, I think, is to cause discord and spread disinformation and make people in America generally distrust our political system. Does anybody vehemently disagree with that? Any of the panel members? No, I'm not seeing any big yeses. So with that, these are the rhetorical questions. How was it in, let me preface it with this. Every one of us here is probably disappointed in every administration's response to some of this stuff at some level. However, I think it's important to kind of correct the record over the long term here. How was it in the United States' interest to not realize the full extent of Russian influence operations and then the reluctance to act until after the election? How was that in America's interest? How was it in America's interest to do almost nothing of import and effectiveness regarding Ukraine and Crimea, regarding a resurgent Russia? How was it in America's interest to happily cut our military capability and telegraph that all around the world? How was it in our interest to scale back missile defense plans in Europe? How was it in our interest to allow Russia to play a pivotal role in the Iran nuclear agreement? And it wasn't in our interest, I don't think, to fail to get a multilateral agreement with Russia on the Syrian civil war. How was it our interest to, when the previous president said to Medvedev that he just needed a little more time regarding missiles and our missile capability in Europe? How did it serve America to have the sale of U.S. uranium capability? And how did it serve America's interest to provide access to Russia regarding technology, including hypersonic cruise missile technology at Skolkovo? That was the previous, that's all the previous administration. And like I said, there's frustration on both sides. I wonder how long that Russia has been suspected of violating all the missile agreements that we've, and nuclear or arms agreement. It's been since we've had them, essentially, right? So my question essentially is this, and Ambassador Fried, I agree with you. Americans don't want to be in a fight with Russia or anybody. We would like to get along with everybody. Unfortunately, the Russians have a vote, or at least their leaders do, and they vote otherwise, right? And we have to deal with the reality of that. And I wonder, because each of you have spoken about unity, Ambassador Nuland, Ambassador Fried, about unity in the United States, and General Keane, you have as well, about our unity and our singular purpose regarding Russia. How can there be unity when some in positions of great leadership and authority continue to promulgate the narrative that this president is a traitor and a collaborator with Russia based on what has now been determined by the special counsel, millions of dollars, 2 years, subpoenas, interviews, et cetera, to be patently false? How can there be unity? How can there be unity when this body passes bills to limit this president's capabilities in Venezuela? That's just a general question. You can comment on that, any of that. Ambassador Nuland, you said a lot fast, and I wish I had your testimony, but you said something about the lesson from the Mueller report. And I think you referenced that this is the president's victory. It didn't have anything to do with Russia. And I think the assumption is that this president needs to learn that lesson and move on. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. So the lesson to who? Is it to the president or to folks in the United States and in this Congress that continue to accuse the president of being a traitor and collaborating with Russia? I'm wondering who the lesson is for.
Congressman Perry, just to repeat what I said, the lesson of the Mueller report and from our intelligence community before was that Putin seeks, as you said, to pit Americans against each other, to destroy our democratic system, to erode trust. So what I was trying to say was, I think we are all seeking stronger presidential leadership vis-a-vis the Kremlin to ensure that he cannot do it again in 2020, in 2022, in 2024, starting with some stronger statements. And I would like to have stronger statements about Russian activities in Venezuela and in Ukraine and in Syria. That would be a start, and it would change Putin's calculus immediately. And then if we had actual actions to strengthen ourselves and make it cost for him, from this White House, that would also begin to reverse the balance.
I think you will find few people up here on either side that would object to that. But would you agree that this president has been limited by the anchor that's been placed around his neck and thrown to the bottom of the ocean with this whole Russian collusion? You're a traitor, and you're working with them to undermine the United States, and that anything he does, even when the Russians actually come into compliance, we refuse to lift the sanctions on certain occasions in this body. Is that a limitation for this president, to this administration, in dealing with Russia effectively?
I would have argued the opposite, that if the president had taken a very strong stand against Russian aggression in our democracy from the day of his inauguration, he would have been stronger domestically as well in the context of the Mueller investigation.
Thank you.
Are you out of time?
General, I would love to hear your comment.
Well, I think that list that you presented, certainly the degree that all that happened, I suspect, was a strategic surprise to Putin to a certain degree. I mean, clearly, when he came into power, he wanted to weaken the transatlantic alliance for all the reasons we know so well. But then he was given, I think, an opportunity as the United States was disengaging to pursue other strategic objectives. And that is why he's in the Middle East. That is why he's aggressively in Africa. And now he's also in the Western Hemisphere. As Ambassador Fried said, he's an opportunist. He's smart, he thinks strategically, and he's taken advantage of the playing field. And that's what we're facing. Now, I think it's a mistake to assume that because President Trump desires to have a personal relationship with Putin as a result of his diplomatic efforts, that the United States is not pushing back on Russia. When you look at the policy, they are. What we're suggesting, and certainly what I'm suggesting, is we can do considerably better than where we are right now. Much more comprehensively, much more strategically, and much more involved with our allies in doing it.
Thank you, General. Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to our witnesses. I'm grateful you're here. There's a hearing occurring right now on the other side of the Capitol that surely is filled to the brim with observers, media, cameras, surely more senators. And frankly, I'm appalled and surprised and disappointed that this hearing isn't attracting the same attention, because I think the gravity, the consequences, and the acute nature of it is one of the great risks to our country right now. And if there's one element of the Mueller report, I think, on which we all agree, it is that Russia meddled in our recent elections, and they seek to undermine our democratic process, and they will surely do so again. And we are not alone. I know the Alliance for Securing Democracy in 2017 identified at least 27 examples of Russian meddling since 2004 in other countries. So my first question is, are there methods being deployed by any of our allies around the world that have curbed or diminished the impact of such behavior? If we'd start with you, Ambassador Fried.
During the French elections, the Russians hacked the Macron campaign and released a bunch of emails that were intended to embarrass him. But the impact in France was very different than what happened in the United States. The French civil society activists exposed the Russian play. And the big story in France, instead of the contents of the emails, was the Russians are trying to interfere in our election, and to hell with them. That's my characterization. And that was an example of turning back a Russian effort at interfering in elections. What happened was society rejected it. And you also had civil society activists able to spot the Russian interference, and a general population and media ready to expose it. That was a successful example. Now, the Russians aren't going to repeat the same tactics. They're going to evolve, but the basic model is there. That is, expose what the Russians are doing, and then focus on that rather than get involved in the whatever nonsense the Russians are peddling or whatever documents they've stolen. Yes, we can push back.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Nuland.
Just to say, I agree completely. The Macron example is the best one and the most publicly understood one. Sunshine is the best disinfectant. So exposing this stuff for what it is, which is inauthentic interference in what should be a domestic conversation. The Germans also did very well with the influence campaign the Russians tried to enact when claiming that a Russian-German girl had been attacked when in fact she hadn't. And the German leadership, led by Chancellor Merkel, exposed that for what it was and created a much better understanding, I think, within the German public that they should question what they read in this regard. So, you know, that's something that needs to be done in the United States. We also need better public education about this stuff and with our allies across Europe.
Thank you. General Keane, anything to add?
I associate myself with my colleagues on those comments. And one thing I would add is that this administration has taken a positive step in deregulating our capability to respond through offensive cyber much more timely and rapidly than what we've had in the past in terms of decision-making authority and the layers of bureaucracy and lawyers you had to go through to do it. And we have been somewhat reluctant. We have absolutely, hands down, the best offensive cyber capability in the world. The Russians have second. And there are times when clearly it's appropriate to use it, when they're attacking us. And as a result of that, that in itself becomes a deterrent. And I think now that there's more freedom to be able to use that in concert with our values and in concert with appropriate oversight, hopefully we'll be able to use that as a way also of pushing back.
Thank you. One more question for Ambassador Fried. In the first weeks of the current administration, did it indeed try to lift sanctions against Russia?
I believe that there was some consideration being given to that. I'm being very careful the way I phrase it because I can't prove it. I don't have documents. But I believe that there were some in the incoming team who simply wanted to do a quick deal. Now, that was defeated, and it was defeated partly, in fact, principally because of the strong reaction in Congress. I'm not, as an executive branch veteran, I'm not usually a believer in legislation to impose sanctions. In this case, I think what Congress did with the CATSA bill, now law, was the right thing to do under those circumstances.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I yield back.
Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the panel. You know, one of the growing concerns, obviously, is Russia, and that's why we're here today. And, you know, we see them going from the failed USSR to where they are today, and we all know that Putin wants to rebuild the Russian Empire. And we can't change what's happened in the past, you know, with past administrations. We're here today at this point. And what I see is that change in world powers, the tectonic shift in world powers that we haven't seen since World War II and at the end of the Cold War. And now we're seeing a resurgence with a strong China. And the concern that we have today is what's going on in the Western Hemisphere, is something that we really need to pay attention. And I think this goes way beyond just Venezuela and Maduro. I think this is a Rubicon moment where Russia cannot allow Maduro to fail. Cuba cannot allow Russia or Maduro to fail, because if they do, if he does fail, that means the Russian system and the Cuban system and even the Chinese and Iran with their influence in there and a little bit of Turkey, it all shows that those kind of autocratic or communist regimes or dictatorial type of regimes that suppress people can't succeed. What are your thoughts on that as far as moving forward, as far as holding Russia accountable? What can we do to offset what they're doing in the Western Hemisphere? Whoever wants to take that first. General
I totally
King?
agree with the premise that strategically it's much more important than what's taken place in our Western Hemisphere because of the implications that I think the Trump administration got it right strategically immediately, that asking for a transition of government with Maduro after he manipulated the election, and there was somebody available to take over who's president of the National Assembly, and working to get global support for that, now up to 54 countries, was the right thing to do, because I do believe that the national security team saw the strategic implications of it in terms of its impact on Nicaragua and also Cuba, and particularly the heavy hand that the countries that you identified have in these states in terms of Russia, China, Iran.
And they're all anti-Western democracies.
Absolutely. And particularly Russia and China see this. China obviously leads with economic investment,
Sure,
and intimidation along with that. But Russia leads also with hybrid warfare intervention as well as economic investment. And they certainly see the opportunity to exploit their national interests in our hemisphere.
let me come back to you because I want to ask
critical
you
what's
about the
happening.
hyper warfare. Ambassador Fried, if you want to weigh in on what your thoughts on that.
Maduro and the Cubans and the Russians want to make this about the Yankees leaning on a sovereign state.
Right.
That's not the real issue. Therefore, our play ought to include working as closely as we can with Latin American countries, which I think this administration is doing, and with the European Union, which is, the Europeans are on the side of Venezuelan democracy. We ought to use this to isolate the Russians and not let them frame this as a kind of Yankee imperialist thing. And that's why I hope that this administration will keep building relations and investing capital in our allies so we can use it in common causes.
We're going to help them do that. We just came back from a bipartisan delegation trip to Colombia that we bordered the Venezuelan border. Ambassador Newland, if you have anything you want to add to that.
Just to say that I think your premise is right. This is not only about great power competition. This is about ideological and systemic competition again, and we need to fight with and for our team.
We cannot afford for this not to, for Maduro. Maduro has to go. And I hope the first thing that a legitimate president, Guaido, does is throws out all foreign military personnel out of his country. General Keane, I want to go back to during a recent speech, the top general of Russia, Valery, I'm going to butcher this, Gerasimov, the so-called creator of the Russian active measures, doubled down on Russia's use of hyper warfare. Do you feel Russia is ahead of us in hyper warfare? And if so, do you think that Bradley Manning or Edward Snowden, with the intelligence breaches that they did, played into Russia's hand and made them jump ahead of us in this? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, General Gerasimov is a brilliant strategist.
Thank you for saying that properly.
And what drove them to this is they were quite stunned by the liberation of Kuwait when they saw the prowess of the United States military and coalition partners, but largely United States military, and the integration of air power and ground power and high-end conventional warfare. And then once again repeated with the liberation of Iraq in 2003, so much so that they changed their strategies. They recognized they could never deal, at that time, with a high-end conventional war. And General Gerasimov developed a doctrine with some leaders around him that we can try to achieve our geopolitical objectives and operate below the level of major conventional confrontation. And so influence operations, election meddling, they're all part of the fabric of that, disguising the use of Russian troops, massive disinformation campaigns, and particularly on their own audience, domestic audience, on the United States audience. When the information campaign, when they went into Crimea and Ukraine, was so significant, it paralyzed decision makers in the United States and in Europe as to what is this? It cast doubt about the execution of it. It doesn't look like warfare, but yet they seem to be taking control.
And very astute at it. I'm out of time, but I'd love to follow up with you on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the panel for being here today. We've seen just in the past decade or so, Russia has launched military incursions into Georgia and Ukraine, intervened in Syria to support Assad, in Venezuela to boost Maduro, back to coup attempt in Montenegro, used chemical weapons and assassination as a tool of assassination in Europe. They tried to destabilize democracy in Europe and the United States, most notably interfering in the 2016 election. Volume 1 of Special Counsel Mueller's report notes that the Russian government interfered in the 2016 presidential election in sweeping and systematic fashion. It then meticulously details how the Kremlin meddled in our democracy. And the U.S. intelligence community unanimously reached the same conclusion in January of 2017. Let me start with that last point and move backward. That's what the Kremlin tried to do here in 2016. I'd ask, starting with you, Ambassador Newland, to talk about Russia's attempts to meddle in democratic elections elsewhere, and as we're having this discussion in advance of the EU elections, let's talk about that, and then the role that Russia has played in Europe in helping to promote some of the far-right parties who have now attained places in government in countries for the first time in history. Please.
Thank you, Congressman Deutsch. Just to remind that Russia's manipulation of elections and its perfection of its strategies and tactics for this began in Russia itself, as it sought to manipulate elections for President Putin and his allies, and various techniques there, moving into the first cyber efforts that we saw in Estonia in the aught years, and then, as we've discussed throughout the hearing, their efforts in France, their efforts to strengthen far-right and far-left parties in order to stress the center of politics in countries from Germany to Italy to many believe that they were active in the Brexit vote as well, and certainly playing in the Eastern and Central European rim, and it's not simply their digital tactics and techniques, it's also their other tools of influence that are as old as Russia and the Soviet Union itself, buying politicians, setting up false flag NGOs, creating inauthentic conversation within politics and policies. So this is well practiced. It predated the digital age, but it's now turbocharged in the digital age. So as we all said in our testimony, and we outlined some concrete steps, this is not an insurmountable challenge. If we harden ourselves here, if we expose what's going on both with digital and with money and with corruption of politicians, and if we work in concert with our allies to pool information, and if we are willing to apply some of the same medicine to Putin himself, where he is vulnerable at home, notably on corruption.
Ambassador Fried.
So one of the knocks against the European Union is that it's a big bureaucracy. But they're way ahead of us in dealing with disinformation. One thing they know how to do is regulate. The European Union has forced the big social media companies to sign on to a voluntary code of practice, basically promising they're going to clean up their act. This gives the Europeans leverage. In my view, we ought to be talking to the Europeans, coming up with a joint plan, and getting using our combined leverage to get the social media companies to do the right thing. Exactly as Ambassador Nuland said, purge the inauthentic accounts, the imposters, clean up social media so that the Russians can't infiltrate it. These are all doable, and I'm not talking about censorship or content control. We should, if the Trump administration believes that great power rivalry pits us against autocratic foes, then we ought to align ourselves with our democratic friends, operationally, not just rhetorically.
Just General, if I may, although I have a lot of questions, I'd like to ask a follow-up there. And actually, Ambassador Nuland, Ambassador Fried, I'm particularly interested in Russian support in promoting white nationalist narratives and ideology, and perhaps we could talk about that after. General, I just want to turn to Russia in Syria. Is there a role to play? Talk about Russia's relationship to Iran in Syria. Can they be counted upon to limit Iranian influence in Syria? Is their sole goal to, as you referred to achieve their positions with the port? What can we expect? What's reasonable to expect?
Yeah, that's a great question, Congressman. Qasem Soleimani, acting on behalf of the Supreme Leader in 2014, visited Moscow twice and met with Vladimir Putin to motivate him to conduct a military intervention into Syria. Initially, no, they did not agree. And they were painting a picture that the Syrian opposition forces, largely led by the radicals, were having their way with the regime that they hadn't had in some time. And then finally, Putin agreed that summer, and you saw the intervention take place in the fall. The Iranians run the war in Syria. They run the ground war. The IRGC has had 2 to 3 of their generals killed. They direct the air power that's being used. So even though Russia is a much larger country geopolitically, it's the Iranians who are really, truly in charge. And so the thought that Putin is somehow going to curb Iranian behavior, it is not going to happen. The Iranians are fixed on their strategic objective, which is regional hegemon at the expense of the United States and encroach on the sovereignty of Israel. They are about that business, and Russia will not be able to reduce their strategic objectives.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, go ahead.
Just to say that it actually serves Russia's interest to have Iran there, because they learned from Afghanistan and from our experience in Iraq that they themselves don't want to be on the ground. They want to have another country do that dirty work. So they want the Iranians on the ground keeping social order and those things, and they want the Cubans on the ground in Venezuela. So this is a strategy that is well honed now.
Thank you. Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, all of you, thank you for being here. This is a great panel and on a really important subject. I actually am really worried about, really the last few years, kind of where foreign policy has gone in terms of our ability to talk about it. I think, the days of kind of consensus foreign policy and having, polite debates has kind of gone away, and everything is now being seen through a political spectrum, which is actually pretty frightening to me, given that we're the United States of America, and we have such an important role to play in the world. Look, under the last administration, Russia meddled in the election. I 100% believe that. I believe President Obama should have been clear at the very beginning of what was happening. The question now isn't how do we continue to look back and lay blame at people's feet. It's how do we prevent it in the future? How do we go forward and make it clear to the American people when they're reading a news article that's actually produced by Russian propaganda, and then is being retweeted by RT, and then ends up on Facebook, and ends up on Twitter, and now is basically seen as gospel. We saw that happen the last election. It's going to happen again this time. So I think if we can now, as a committee, come together, and as a country come together and figure out how to expose that, and say, look, I don't care who you elect for President of the United States, but I want it to be an American decision, not influenced by especially the Russians. I want to look at our hemisphere, though. We've talked a little about Venezuela, and I want to ask you, General, a question. If the United States, so this committee passed, I don't know if you guys know this, thankfully it hasn't passed, I don't think, the floor yet, but passed a preemptive prevention of the president from using military action in Venezuela. So thankfully it's not going to be passed by the Senate and signed by the president, but I think it was a terrible message to send out of the Foreign Policy Committee. But let me ask a question to you, General. If the United States, we're talking hypothetically and just your definition, if the United States placed 20 to 25,000 troops into Venezuela and surrounded Guaido, would you consider that? Do you think the Webster definition would call that a military intervention? I'm just asking generally, would that be considered a military intervention?
Where are the troops?
U.S. troops, let's say.
Where physically are they?
We'd put them right in the middle of Venezuela.
Of course.
Okay. And what about if the United States had basically intelligence assets and counter-defense, things like that, if we put them in Venezuela, I would say that would also be considered military intervention. So the point I make is Cuba has already intervened militarily in our hemisphere. The Russians have already intervened militarily in our hemisphere. So when there's this preemptive thing about we're worried about military intervention, in the hemisphere of the United States of America, Russia and its allies have already intervened militarily in our hemisphere, in Venezuela. And so my question to you is this. We obviously know the terrible thing of what's going on, and I think the future of the United States of America and our hemisphere is going to be dependent on what happens in Venezuela. It's going to be, is this a march towards freedom? I mean, we talk about our issues on the southern border, and they're serious. But the reason is because people are fleeing corrupt leaders. They're fleeing corrupt countries. And they're fleeing the inability to have freedom. They're fleeing cartels. A strong Central and South America is good for the United States. So let me ask you a question. What would a U.S. show of force? So as we're looking at this debate in Venezuela and saying really the key is what side is the military on? Does the military side with Guaido or does it stay with the illegitimate government of Maduro? Would a U.S. show of force, not a military intervention, but putting military assets nearby and making it clear that we exist, would that be beneficial, do you think, General, in helping to change the calculus of some of these military generals?
Well, Certainly the premise that you're making about intervention militarily by the Cubans and certainly by Russia, as I said, it's part of their hybrid warfare doctrinal playbook, is a serious intervention and has huge strategic implications. I think the opening of the door to Cuba and hoping that somehow they would move towards democratic values and free enterprise, I don't see any evidence of that. They're still maintaining their aggressive stance. Given the volatility of the situation that exists in Venezuela, I don't think, one, we should take any military action at this time. Two, I don't think we should even contemplate such a thing without consulting with our allies in the region and doing, if military action was called for, to do it in concert with them. I would, if I was working for the administration, I would not be recommending military action. I would be recommending exactly what the administration is trying to do, which is cultivate the leadership that's around Maduro and separate that leadership from Maduro. And there's some evidence that some of that has been working, and continue those efforts. And certainly, and why? Can the United States roll into Venezuela and conduct some kind of military operation similar to what we've done in the past in Haiti or Panama and bring it to a conclusion? Yes. But also, military operations, despite the best of intentions, have a tendency not necessarily to go in the direction that you want them to go. And then as a result of it, we also own the aftermath of that, what's taken place in that country. So I would exercise caution, even though there's energy surrounding this and there's a desire to want to do something. And we certainly don't want thousands of Venezuelan people killed in the streets.
Thank you. And I'll just say, I think, but taking that option off the table preemptively does not help diplomacy in that matter. And
well, it should never come off the table. Right. I mean, I can't imagine any president, Democrat or Republican, would always want that on the table as leverage to use diplomatically.
Thank you. And Ambassador Newland, I had so many questions for you. Good to see you. I'm way out of time. I'll yield back.
Mr. Bearer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Ambassador Fried, for continuing to point back to the CATSA Act of 2017 and as things that we can actually do in Congress. And Mr. Chairman, Ambassador Fried made reference to a report, and I would ask unanimous consent to add to the record the unclassified report to Congress to Section 241 of the CATSA Act of 2017, and that was dated January 29, 2018. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, if I could have unanimous consent to add that to the record.
Yes,
Thank
without
you.
objection.
I think the Russian people would be pretty interested in the large number of oligarchs that are worth over $1 billion. I think the Russian people would be interested in, who their top government officials are, what they're worth, et cetera, where the wealth of Russia is actually going. I think some of my concern, we do have strategic tools to get this information out there. I think it ought to make them a little bit worried, and we ought to be using those tools. My concern with the administration is, Vladimir Putin's playing, if we were playing cards, he doesn't have a great hand that he's playing, but we keep folding our hand, so he keeps winning round after round. And we had our disagreements with the Obama administration, but we had the ability as members of Congress and as the Foreign Affairs Committee to sit down in classified and unclassified settings to voice those differences, but at the end of the day to speak with one voice, and we understood what that strategy was, whether we agreed with it or didn't agree with it. The challenge we're having with the current administration is, Ambassador Newland, you were asking me what our strategy in Venezuela is. I don't have an answer for you right now, and that concerns me. We can do our job having hearings and trying to shine the light on it and express our voice as Congress, but we've got to come up with a coherent, sustained strategy with agreed-upon goals that both the administration and Congress is doing. I guess my question to the three of you, as the chair of the Subcommittee on Oversight, what would be some recommendations that you would have me do or this full committee do from the congressional perspective that we don't want to dictate foreign policy, but we have a role in this foreign policy, and similar to what we did with CATSA, what are some things that you would like us to do to send a strong message to Russia that this is not okay? Ambassador Nuland, maybe start.
I think the increased pace of hearings of this committee is very, very important. You should have a government panel on Russia where you ask what the overall strategy is and how it's being implemented. Similarly on China, I don't know whether you've been having hearings on China, I assume you have. But I think it's been difficult for folks who are working at the level that Ambassador Fried and I and General Keane worked at to know, in fact, what is a legitimate place to push and what isn't. I just want to come back to something you said at the beginning. I was honored when I was Assistant Secretary to come before this committee probably 8 times, I think, between 2013 and 2016 to talk primarily about Ukraine, but also Ukraine, Russia, Cyprus. And I felt at all times, even when we disagreed or even when we weren't doing as much as you might have wanted, the bipartisan conversation and the rigor of that we could have helped us to be better. So I would encourage you to bring the administration up, because that might also strengthen folks in the engine room because they'll have to articulate the policy.
And we do think there are good folks within the various agencies, et cetera, that share the same concern. So, Ambassador Fried.
There are certainly capable people throughout the U.S. government, NSC, State Department, Treasury, Intelligence community, who understand the Russia problem, who are capable of dealing with it at that level. The U.S. government needs a clear presidential leadership and a strategic framework in which the elements that we've been discussing here all morning can be fit.
Great. And let me make sure to the employees of the State Department, USAID, the DOD, et cetera, I think we have patriotic Americans out there serving us every day that want that clear direction and want that ability to go out there and execute a strategy. General Keane.
Well, I think what we lack is what we have tried to talk about, all 3 panel members in our own individual way. Dealing with Putin today is very different than what Reagan was dealing with Gorbachev, who was trying to salvage a regime that was in decline. And we're dealing with a very aggressive and assertive Russia here, who's operating right on the edge in terms of achieving his national self-interest. But yet, given the seriousness of this, the administration has done a very good job in their national security strategy and national defense strategy in laying out the problem. But what they haven't done a very good job is putting together implementation and a strategy to deal comprehensively with Russia and comprehensively with China. And then also have the president personally and publicly be an advocate for that strategy. And that needs to be done.
Well, and General Keane, maybe that is what we can do, and our appropriate oversight role is help lay out that strategy in a way that we can hand over to the administration and obviously let them execute a strategy that doesn't stop with one administration or another. In the Cold War, it was a sustained strategy, and Congress did have a big role. So, I do look forward to our doing that. There's nothing that stops us from, creating a select committee to look at the Russian interference in the 2016 election and come up with strong recommendations of how we can counteract that. So, thank you for your service, and with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mrs. Wagner.
I thank the chairman and the ranking member for organizing this hearing, and I thank our witnesses for their time and their tremendous public service. I represent the St. Louis metro area, which is home to the largest Bosnian community outside of Bosnia and Herzegovina. About 20 years ago, our Bosnian neighbors fled to St. Louis after war criminal Ratko Mladic initiated a horrific genocide against majority Muslim Bosniaks. The Dayton Agreement ended the Bosnian War in 1995, as we know, but today, Russia is undermining the peace agreement. Frankly, they're undermining peace and freedom, as we've seen in Syria, as we've seen in Georgia, the Ukraine, our own elections, now in Venezuela, and across the globe. But they're undermining the peace agreement by encouraging separatists in the Serb-majority Republika Srpska. I am deeply concerned that Russia is fueling ethnic divides in the interest of weakening the Bosnian state. Ambassador Fried, how can the United States counteract Russian activities in Bosnia?
The Russians are acting throughout the Balkans to try to prevent those countries from drawing closer to or joining the EU and NATO. An attempted coup in Montenegro, the Russians tried to block the agreement between Greece and North Macedonia, which is one of the best pieces of news to come out of the Balkans in years. And I am reasonably confident that the Russians would rather instigate conflict rather than let Bosnia and Herzegovina succeed in reforming itself. So I think they are playing the card of potential secession of Republika Srpska to prevent that from happening, and also to prevent Serbia, which is the big game, from turning westward in a decisive way. What we can do is principally show up, work with Europe in support of plans to integrate all of these countries into the West, have them draw closer to the European Union and get on track for EU accession. That's powerful. The EU has money. Russia doesn't. The EU throughout Europe and throughout the Balkans means prosperity.
Well, the EU needs to engage, because I'm very concerned about this. And further, let me just say, because I've got such limited time, further, in Georgia, Russia uses a strategy of, I'll call it creeping annexation, to quietly seize more and more Georgian sovereign territory. Sometimes it's yards at a time. Today, Russia has managed to convert about 20% of Georgia's internationally recognized territory to disputed territory. General Keane, how should the U.S. response to Russian aggression in Georgia differ from its response to the Ukraine conflict, where Russia moved much more quickly and decisively?
Appreciate the question. We have begun to take some steps to assist them. Certainly, last year we provided them anti-tank weapons to the Georgian military, and we conducted some critical military exercises with the Georgians right on the 10th anniversary of Russia's invasion. So we're not ignoring them, certainly. And I also think what we need to do is encourage our European allies to be as involved as we have begun to be in Georgia. Also, obviously, they already are dealing with Ukraine. I don't believe for a minute that the issues of success that Russia has enjoyed using a hybrid warfare, that we have to cede to that success. We have significant geopolitical influence. We have economically things that we can do, and certainly militarily there's some things.
Well, we all must collectively step up in NATO, the EU, and the U.S. Russia's behavior has been increasingly aggressive in the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait. After Russia seized the 3 Ukrainian vessels near the strait last November, the United States conducted I think, a freedom of navigation operation in Peter the Great Bay, the first since the Cold War. Ambassador Nuland, what other methods can the U.S. use to encourage Russia to comply with international laws that govern the use of maritime commons?
Well, we eventually did exact some sanctions, but it took about 6 months. If we had been ready ahead of time and been able to move quickly and move in a way that had hurt the Kremlin a little bit more, we might have been able to have more immediate impact. But what's most important, I think, is how do you keep Russia from accreting into more Ukrainian territory? Right. So when they build this bridge across the strait and then they landlock essentially with that bridge major grain ports of of Mariupol and Berdyansk in Ukraine. They essentially gain by sea what they couldn't gain by land. So my favorite idea, and I don't know whether the administration considered it, was put forward by Carl Bildt, former Swedish prime minister and foreign minister, which would have been to have the OSCE or some coalition of interested neutral naval powers like Finland and Sweden offer patrolling to keep the Sea of Azov open for both Ukraine and Russia. And that's the kind of passive eyes on the street, if you will, that we might have been able to organize and help pay for.
Very important. I'm glad to have the testimony today for the record to submit to the administration. I have run out of time. I appreciate the chair's indulgence. I thank you all for your service, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I represent a district in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, as you undoubtedly know, has the second largest population of Ukrainian Americans in the United States. My district, which is the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania, has a very significant Ukrainian American population, and they have shared with me some of their concerns about Russia and its activities in Ukraine. Mr. Fried, if I may, you wrote in your testimony that Putin, like Soviet leaders before him, seeks to weaken the European Union and NATO and to discredit the idea of democracy as a potentially appealing alternative for Russia. Clearly, the Kremlin does not want Ukraine to succeed in its attempt to transform itself from a Putin-dependent government into a free market democracy that grows closer with Europe, because obviously that would show Russians that if Ukrainians can succeed in such a transformation, perhaps so could they. So what I wanted to ask you is whether you could discuss Russia's strategy to counteract the efforts of nearby countries that are trying to build or expand democratic governments, and what we, the United States, need to do in turn to counteract Russia's efforts to stop democracy in those countries such as Ukraine.
You're right that Russia fears a successful democratic Ukraine, because that would be a body blow and possibly a fatal body blow to Putinism. Not to Russia, but to Putinism. Russia's tactics, well, Russia seeks to prevent all of its immediate neighbors, Georgia, Ukraine, from becoming successful modern democracies drawing closer to Europe. They manufacture conflicts, they create border problems, they seize territory. In the case of Ukraine, it was their association agreement that triggered the protests that led to bloodshed and then the Russian intervention. What we can do is help the reformers in those countries. We know how to do this. We did it after 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. We helped the Poles, we helped the Baltic states, we helped the Romanians, and we succeeded. We ought to be getting behind the reformist forces there. The Ukrainians have had trouble maintaining a steady pace of reform. Now they've demonstrated a free and fair election. They're going to have a new president. They're going to have parliamentary elections. General Keane has said this, and I agree with him. We need to help the Ukrainians deliver at home for their people and fight corruption. That was the big deal in the last elections. In doing so, the Ukrainians will generate political capital for themselves, draw closer to Europe, and of all the world's big problems, Ukraine is the one with the greatest chances of a really good outcome for the United States, for the Ukrainian people, and for freedom generally.
And do you believe that U.S. support is critical in order for Ukraine to accomplish that?
U.S. support and European support together.
Okay, thank you. And to Ambassador Fried or Ambassador Nuland, since 2014, the United States has used sanctions as a central tenet of foreign policy to counter Russian aggression. And yet, sanctions have not led to Russia's withdrawal from Ukraine, nor did they prevent an escalation of Russian involvement in Syria, or prevent Russia from increasing support to the Maduro regime in Venezuela. How important is it that we coordinate United States sanctions with our European and other allies? And how can we do a better job of coordinating those sanctions? And the last part of this, because time's running out, is what advice would you give to this administration to improve the effectiveness of sanctions?
The last administration coordinated sanctions with the European Union. I was the chief negotiator, so I did this. We may have to escalate our sanctions in support of a Ukraine settlement. If we do so, we should do so with Europe. I hate to say it, but my old office, the sanctions coordinator's office at State, was abolished. You need a negotiator. You need somebody with rank doing it.
Thank you. My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Zeldin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having today's hearing. I wanted to ask a couple of important questions to give everyone an opportunity to respond with a limited amount of time. Nord Stream 2, I think it's, in my opinion, not in the best interest of the United States and our allies to be pursuing further development of Nord Stream 2, that it would be great for an ally like Germany to be pursuing more energy cooperation and expansion between the United States and Germany rather than seeing expansion between Germany and Russia. Thoughts on Nord Stream 2? Thoughts on the way Germany should be handling it?
Thanks, Congressman Zeldin. We worked very hard on this in the previous administration to try to slow down the process of Nord Stream 2 and to work specifically with the European Union. So the European Union has very tough rules called the Third Energy Package on when and where you can build pipelines. And so when we worked with the European Union, we were able to question things like the security, sustainability, the environmental reliability, whether Germany actually needed this energy, whether there were other alternatives. We also worked with all the littoral states, the states whose territory and undersea passages the pipeline would pass through, and we were able to slow it significantly. I think that's a better strategy than simply rhetorically beating the drum at the same time that we try to bring more U.S. LNG and other global LNG as an alternative to Europe and particularly to Germany.
Any other witnesses want to weigh in with regards to Nord Stream 2?
I agree with the sentiments already expressed. I would just add that I think the United States, in concert with our European friends, can do more in the energy sector, particularly natural gas, in terms of impacting Russia's major sources of income, which largely surrounds energy, obviously, as almost a one-commodity country. And the geopolitical implications of that are obvious, and we can clearly be more aggressive about it.
I never liked Nord Stream 2, didn't like much like Nord Stream 1. I don't favor the use of sanctions to try to kill it, but I think Germany needs to do more to mitigate the strategic downsides of their own of this bad idea. By which I mean they ought to show leadership in Europe to create alternative sources of natural gas and LNG, and weaken the Russians' ability to put Europe in a hammerlock through the use of energy blackmail.
Any of the witnesses familiar with letters sent last week by the German ambassador to the United States to members of the United States Senate with regards to Nord Stream 2 and possible retaliatory actions by Germany? There was a story that came out yesterday in the Wall Street Journal. It was previously reported just before the weekend. The German ambassador sent letters to United States senators threatening retaliatory action as it relates to the LNG that was just referenced in your answers to the last question. What we have been experiencing with by the way, the United States ambassador to Germany, Rick Grinnell's doing a fantastic job. Every time he sneezes in a way that a German politician doesn't like, someone's calling for him to be kicked out of the country or some other horrible response. And it's unfortunate that Germany is not embracing an opportunity to improve dialogue with someone who is honestly reflecting the policy of the United States under the current administration. In response to the letters being sent by the German ambassador to the United States, I'm not going to do what the German politicians will do to Ambassador Grinnell. The German ambassador is stating a policy, a position, a statement, a threat, however you want to take it, on behalf of the German government. And I don't believe that it's a good idea for us to stop talking to the German ambassador. I don't think it's a productive idea to threaten the German ambassador or call on Germany to replace the German ambassador. So I think that this is an important moment, specifically as it relates to Nord Stream 2, and a reflection of the behavior of German politicians as it relates to our U.S. ambassador to Germany, who is doing a fantastic job. That between allies, we should be able to have honest conversations between our countries and move forward in a healthier, more productive manner. We might be in a different place with Nord Stream 2. We should get to a better place with Nord Stream 2, as well as increased LNG imports. And the threats are not helpful, but I'm not going to respond the way the German politicians would respond to Ambassador Grinnell. But I appreciate all the witnesses for being here and for the chairman for holding today's hearing. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to focus my questioning in a different light, really more about the 2016 elections and Russian meddling. And we may differ on collusion, we may differ on obstruction of justice, but clearly, given the Mueller report, there's no doubt, absolutely no doubt, that the Russian government blatantly interfered in U.S. elections in 2016. We saw that on Volume 1 of the Mueller report, as early as 2014, the Russian Internet Research Agency, IRA, was actively working to influence the 2016 elections through aggressive social media campaigns and actually on the ground in the U.S. In fact, they sent agents to gather intelligence in the U.S. as early as 2014. The IRA used political ads, both social media space, forums, forcibly engaging American voters and to stoke hate and fear. And the IRA also hacked into state election boards and voter systems and companies which sold election software to state boards of elections across the country. They targeted congressional races as well. Maybe some of the members in this committee, their district were targeted. My question is the following. Did the Russians tamper with state voter systems? Did they tamper with voter lists or systems across different states? Ambassador Nuland, or anybody on the panel?
I believe that it is publicly disclosed now that they successfully acquired voter rolls in some states, but I don't believe it was proven that they were able to actually manipulate or change voting, which is not to say that they didn't try and not to say that they won't try going forward. It's certainly a strategy that they use at home.
Do you know which districts or which states were targeted by this activity?
I don't have that, I'm sorry, but I think I've testified a number of times before Senate Intel and House Intel. I think they can help you with that.
Okay. The Mueller report further states that Russian government interfered in the 2016 presidential election in sweeping and systematic fashion in regards to hacking attempts of state board of elections. Okay. So I want to also ask, if proven that they have in fact tampered with state elections and voter rolls or lists in those respective states where you may have frontline or competitive races that will determine the majority of this institution, do you feel that state law enforcement or federal prosecutors have the right to go after these folks, including some potential collaborators in the United States? Anybody?
I mean, I think as we've all said, we need a much stronger presidentially led set of policies and tools to deal with this. I would include in that strengthening our legal and regulatory regime so that any Americans who are participatory willingly and knowingly in any of this, including influence campaigns or voter suppression or any of it, face far harsher legal penalties, including LPRs and others in the United States. So there's a lot more we can do within this basket. What you mentioned is one aspect, but it's much bigger than that. I just, while I have the mic, mentioned that I think when CIA Director Haspel came up to the Hill not too long ago, she called for more resources for the CIA. FBI also has seen its ability to counter this stuff attrit over the, at the end of the Cold War. So when you think about what Congress can do, that's another area to really strengthen our intelligence resources and coordination through a fusion center.
Finally, as we work to counter Russia's malign activity in the U.S. and around the globe, I want to ensure that we are targeting the Russian government and ensuring that Russian citizens and civil society do not suffer because of the Putin regime. Can you suggest principles Congress should follow to strengthen dialogue with the Russian people and for supporting civil society in general in Russia? I think that's an important component that hasn't been addressed.
During the Cold War, we successfully reached out to Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Balts, all manner of people. We let some of that capacity atrophy. It's now a digital age. I think that we ought to develop tools to reach out to them, both directly, but also by supporting civil society groups. Democracy promotion can work if we're not too impatient. It takes time, but it can yield spectacularly good results. Again, we learned this during the Cold War. And I think reaching out to the Russian people is possible, but it's probably not possible if the lead is a bunch of government bureaucrats. I think outsourcing this, as the Reagan administration did in its day, is the way to go. But I think that a long-term struggle and long-term outreach to the Russian people is in our interests.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The chair recognizes Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. We've had several hearings during this 116th Congress. Many of those have dealt with both China and Russia. And my question to each of you is, do you feel that the greatest threat to our national security come from China or Russia? And I know and I guess it's two-part. As it exists today, and then looking forward 5 to 10 years from now, do you see that changing? Ms. Ambassador?
Congressman Guest, I believe that we face significant challenge from both. As we've talked about today, I don't think Putin's Russia is 1,000 feet tall. I think we've got the tools and the organization, if we choose to use it, to blunt his ability to hurt us. I think the China challenge is much different, much less well understood, and will require a very long-term effort because they are richer, because they are more ambitious, because they have been more successful at accreting economically and industrially into our and our allies' strategic areas of concern. So again, if this were a China hearing, I would be calling for a whole-of-government approach, presidentially led, rather than simply trade talks or these talks. But China is a generational issue, I believe.
The way I would express it is, I don't think you should play one off against the other, but I do believe that China is a long-term strategic threat to our national security interests. The engine of their economy certainly is that. President Xi has made some very fundamental strategic decisions that his predecessors had not made, and that is to dominate the Western Pacific and Asia. And they're well on their way to achieving that. They're using gray zone operations, again, operating below the level of conflict to achieve those ends. And he's also publicly stated, again, very different from his predecessors, that they fully intend to replace the United States as the global leader of the world. They're the fastest growing military in the world. They now have 355 combat ships. That's a little north of the amount of ships the United States Navy has in its entirety. They have offensive missiles that can hold our carrier battle group at bay in the Western Pacific and can reach every single air base that we have in the Pacific today. They are rapidly developing hypersonic missiles which can destroy surface fleets in a matter of minutes. So clearly, their geopolitical number one strategy is economic around infrastructure and energy, but they're also at the same time projecting power globally, militarily, with bases in the Mediterranean, in Pakistan, and major investment tools, at the same time building a military capability that would take advantage of some of the vulnerabilities that the United States military has. Long-term strategic threat, to be sure. Most important bilateral relationship I think the United States is involved in. We've got to work this thing to try to get it right. We certainly don't want to go to war. I don't think they want to go to war with us, but their strategy is very aggressive, and it's being done at the United States' national interest and those of our allies.
Ambassador Freed, let me ask you another question because my time is limited here. In your report, you state that for the last 20 years after the end of the Cold War, the United States drew down its forces in Europe, and many European countries allowed their militaries to decline. Have we begun seeing in Europe the rebuilding of those militaries which were allowed to decline after the end of the Cold War? And to what extent?
Yes, but not enough, is the short answer. Partly under pressure from President Trump and President Obama, European defense spending has increased, deployable forces is increasing, and NATO has decided to take seriously the Russian security threat. So this is good news. Not enough has been done, but clearly the direction is going the right way. The countries closest to Russia, the Balts, the Poles, the Romanians, are spending a lot more, and their capability is growing. The Germans need to do more, but their defense spending is increasing. We get too involved in a lot of rhetorical battles, but we need to build on this good momentum while we keep pushing for more.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you to our guests. I'm going to recognize myself right now. My first question is in response to the question that Mr. Guest posed. Ambassador Nuland, you made the comment, and I hope I quote you correctly, that we have the tools in the organization to address the threat posed by Russia. And I was curious if you could quickly expound on that. What are the tools, what are the organizations, and how could we make them stronger so that we are successfully addressing the threats posed by Russia?
Thank you, Congresswoman Spanberger. As I say in my testimony, we need first unity of effort inside the U.S. government, then with the Congress, and then with allies, and then with our populations. We need to use all the tools of power, military, economic, digital, et cetera. Each of these challenges is different and requires a separate line of effort. I tried in the testimony to go through the kinds of steps that I would recommend to deal with the digital aggression, to deal with military buildup, et cetera. But specifically, sanctions are useful, but only when they are with allies, when they are targeted, when they can be ratcheted up and ratcheted down when we can come to agreements. So in the Donbass negotiations that I was working on, we were getting to the point where we were going to need to show Russia that good behavior would lead to some sanctions coming off. But when Russia stalled in those negotiations, I could have used an escalatory ladder. But by the same token, what's most important is that we are strong and that we are not willing to give on things that Russia wants or to give them the prestige or the face, if you will, of good relations unless they are working with us rather than against us, and that has to be presidentially led.
You mentioned the presidentially led element of this, and I think that does present some unique challenges. Certainly, as we've seen in the past couple days, the past week, a focus on the Mueller report, and I know that a number of my colleagues have mentioned this. I am curious, from your perspective, we have seen the Mueller report highlighted the systematic disinformation campaign and offensive cyber efforts against our election system. One of my concerns as a former intelligence officer is that this is an example of a first step overture. This is an example of aggressive behavior and tactics that they are willing to take in 2016 against our elections, perhaps before that, perhaps in 2018, speaking specifically about what's in the Mueller report, it's 2016. Do you have concerns that these same sort of aggressive tactics could be used against our electrical infrastructure, our electrical grid, our financial institutions, the hacking, spear phishing, those sorts of efforts, separate from some of the information and disinformation campaigns? Do you have concerns that those might be in Russia's toolbox and things that they might be willing, under some circumstances, to deploy against us? And Ambassador Fried, you were visually responsive, so I'm going to start with you.
Sure. We would be derelict in our duty as a nation if we weren't concerned about this. And this is not hypothetical. We saw the Russians go after the Georgians, go after the Estonians, and this was 11 years ago, 12, and the Ukrainians all the time. This, of course, this is going to be in our toolkit. Now, I want to give the U.S. government some credit. We have stood up Cyber Command. They are active. They are working on hard security. But as Ambassador Nuland has said, this has to be a whole-of-government effort. It has to be presidentially led, and we can't send mixed signals.
To understand that issue, first of all, yes, the Russians have clearly the capability as the second best offensive capability in the world to impact our financial banking system as part of our critical infrastructure, our utility grids, our transportation system, et cetera. They would not do that, in my judgment, pre-conflict operations, because we would know they did it, and they know that we would respond very aggressively to something like that, because the impact on us would be catastrophic. It's like using a nuclear weapon. However, during conflict operations, and we know this for a fact, all of those tools would be used against the American people in the homeland. Not only that, as we're trying to deploy our forces, and you saw our forces deploy to Iraq and to Kuwait and to Afghanistan, and we called that a permissive deployment, where we moved at a time and place of our choosing and no interference. That's over. That will never, ever happen again with a major power like Russia or China. They will interfere with all of that and disrupt it, with cyber and also with kinetic weapons. So yes, conflict operations have changed dramatically because of the very sophisticated offensive cyber operations that our adversaries could conduct if we were in that kind of a conflict.
Thank you to the witnesses. And the chair recognizes my colleague from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Chair Lady, and I'll be brief because I realize I'm standing in the way of possibly y'all getting to the restroom and lunch, so I'll be brief in my questions. And I actually had this for the general, but I'm curious if any of y'all else would like to comment on it, that China and Russia, they've shown an incredible ability to work together, almost hand in glove with each other when it comes to thwarting U.S. interests. But however, opposite the Cold War era, it is now Moscow. It plays the junior partner, seems to me, to junior partner to Beijing. Do y'all think that Putin is okay with this as long as U.S. interests are checked, or will Russian pride eventually win out? I guess this is getting more into the psyche of Mr. Putin, who I've seen pictures of him riding a bear, but I think those are Photoshopped for the record, but I would just be curious.
I think that's an important point.
And for the record, I do not care at all for him.
I think you've made an important point. I believe that China and Russia are perfectly willing to work together to thwart the United States on an opportunistic basis. However, in any kind of Russian-Chinese alliance, Russia is the junior partner. And I do not believe the Chinese have forgotten how the Russians treated them when they were the senior partner in the 19th century. And what I've said to Russian audiences is that light at the end of the tunnel that you think you see may simply be the Chinese waiting for you to emerge, and they will eat you alive. Because Russia should think twice before it signs on to be the junior partner of China. I think that that would be a mistake, and I think that someday the Russians will start to realize it, and even now some of them will whisper, if they think no one else is listening, that they are concerned about where Putinism leads them.
I've served in both countries, lived in both countries. They are not natural allies politically, culturally, economically. In fact, they're quite vicious about each other in closed chambers. I do think the worry now is that there's a lot of learning going on both ways, particularly in the digital space. You know, the Russians are learning about facial recognition and deep fakes from the Chinese, and the Chinese are learning about influence operations and voter suppression from the Russians, and that's just the beginning, not to mention their military interests beginning to align, and particularly what we've talked about throughout the morning about this club of autocrats trying to reverse and change the rules of the liberal international system. So I think we have to watch it. The Russians did not enjoy, after we put on crippling sanctions in 2015 in their energy sector and their banking sector, they went to the Chinese for investment, and they didn't enjoy that exchange because the Chinese really jacked them up. So we can also play in that space if we're playing to contain and deter both of them.
You know, when you look at it politically, economically, militarily, I don't see them coming together in an alliance to support each other across all of those sectors. I think they find each other useful at times, and certainly in dealing with what was the American hegemon. And certainly China does have some economic interest in Russia, surprisingly, even though they have only 150 million people in that country. And their economy is in a tank. Russia is currently building a pipeline to China for oil, which is pretty significant because 62% of China's oil still comes from the Middle East. And it's why China is opening a Navy base in Djibouti, because they know that if we had a conflict with China, we would shut down that oil coming out of the Middle East. So I think they see utility in the relationship, but I don't see an alliance.
A young man from, it's not in my notes, but visited me yesterday, and he was from an area, the district I represent called Powell, and he wrote a poster and I guess a brief on China and their ability to go into these countries and do things, you know, like dams, hydroelectric, things like that, and they'd get into it, and they'd get about 3/4 of the way, and they'd pull the plug on some of it, and he surmised that the reason they did that was they would be more dependent upon them, and then they would be more indebted to them. Does that ring any truth to you all, that sort of philosophy with China? I know, you know, I was in Israel, and I was saddened to see that their deep port was in fact done by the Chinese.
Yes.
As my father would say, the red Chinese, but the Chinese.
The strategy you're talking about there deals with mostly emerging nations, where the Chinese come in and they're going to build infrastructure projects for them, and they negotiate high-interest loans which the country has difficulty paying off the interest, and as a result of it, China owns the infrastructure. And when it's an energy infrastructure, it impacts geopolitically on influence and control in that country. But with a more industrialized state, where they have significant investment projects in Africa, South America, South Asia, et cetera, they don't deliver a quality product. They insist on Chinese labor force, and secondly, the product is not up to standard. I believe this strategy is eventually going to catch up to them unless they make some significant changes. One, they're bullies and intimidators, and I've been around Southeast Asia and other places talking about China to those leaders there. Clearly, China has huge influence, But going along with that, there's a price to be paid in that relationship. And some of that price is not welcome in Beijing, that's for sure. They're quick learners, so they may solve this problem, certainly. But that's kind of the thrust that I see happening.
Thank you, Chair Lady. Of my 103 days in Congress, this has probably been one of the more informative meetings, and I appreciate it. I wish my father was alive to hear what you had to say about the Chinese. He fought them after the Second World War in some limited engagements in the United States Marine Corps, and you've educated me. I want to thank you all very much, all three of y'all. Chair Lady, I'm sorry I went over.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I apologize. The chair now recognizes, no, Mr. Malinowski, sorry.
We good?
We're good.
Okay.
Apologize.
Thanks.
Thank you.
When I used to ask Russian dissidents, how can we help you, they would sometimes shoot back, well, at least stop hurting us by allowing Putin's cronies and oligarchs to hide their money in American real estate, shell companies, and banks. So I'm very glad that you raised that issue, Ambassador Fried. The good news is we have a bipartisan bill. It was introduced in the last Congress. It's about to be reintroduced. I think it may be supported by the administration, I'm hopeful, that will basically say that the true owners of shell companies, of companies registered in the United States, their identities have to be disclosed to the Treasury Department. I just want to ask all three of you, would you support that kind of legislation? I see a thumbs up from General Keane. 3 thumbs up. Good. Well, you'll have an opportunity to tell us more formally soon, I hope. Let me go bigger picture. I think in all of your testimonies, there is a common theme that this isn't just a battle of armies, it's a battle of ideas. Putin has an idea that dictatorships and kleptocracies should be left alone. He seems threatened and offended by institutions like NATO and the EU that try to uphold standards in the world. He seems to be offended and threatened by the notion of the United States leading by example, being a shining city on a hill. So he tries to undermine the institutions, he tries to undermine our reputation, makes us seem like just about any other country. So let me do a little bit of a lightning round with you guys, and maybe I'll start with you, Ambassador Fried, but anybody can jump in. Do we validate or counter Putin's idea when we say that NATO needs to pay us to protect them and question whether we should even be defending small NATO allies like Montenegro? Just quickly.
We're right to push for NATO countries to step up in defense spending. We're wrong to speak in terms of NATO as a protection racket.
How about when we denigrate the EU and suggest that we're cheering on Brexit? Are we validating or countering Putin's idea?
We should support the unity of the democracies because we need our friends to deal with our adversaries. The EU, at worst, can be a bit of a pain to work with, but that's a friend. They're a friend, and an important one.
What about when we throw our support behind a Russian-backed Libyan warlord who's trying to overthrow a government that the UN and the US has recognized? Are we validating or countering Putin's worldview and strategy? Toria, do you want to?
Congressman Malinowski. The Russians have been supporting Haftar's civil war inside Libya for at least 2 years. Why we would want to exacerbate and accelerate that doesn't make any sense to me.
Let's take this closer to home. Are we validating or countering his idea when we call the free press in our country the enemy of the people?
American values and American interests are ultimately indivisible, and this has been the core of America's grand strategy for 100 years. So we ought to get behind our own best traditions. It makes us stronger, not weaker.
Does it help us in this battle of ideas or hurt us when an American president maintains his own personal business empire and takes payments from foreign governments?
Transparency, probity, decency, and financial disclosure are all good things, the mark of, as used to be said, of a healthy republic.
And what about when we accuse our intelligence community of being a deep state that is trying to engage in a coup against our elected leadership?
Talk of coups, treason, enemies is the language that I hadn't heard in common discourse in the West since I was reading about it in history books, and I don't like to see it now.
Just to repeat a line from my opening statement, we enable Putin's quest when our own leaders call into question the basic rights enshrined in our liberal constitution, an independent judiciary, a free press, protection of minority rights, and the oversight powers of this Congress. You named several others in addition.
And just a final
Mr.
question.
Congressman, can I say something here? And I really appreciate you being here from the very outset. I understand what you're saying, and I deal with leaders around the world on the very issue you're talking about, and that is the president's comments. And he makes them on a regular basis, almost daily. And what I tell those leaders, one, you should try to understand that comments. I'm not telling you don't pay attention to it, but what you have to pay attention to is U.S. policy. And U.S. policy is supporting NATO 100%. Now, are there denigrating comments about countries in NATO? Yes. And the president's speech when he went to Poland in the first year of his office and stood up there and talked about the values of NATO and how it's preserved peace and stability in the world, how it's the bastion of all the advanced democracies in the world, and we share all those values together. Yes, we have to look at policy, where we do have a president that talks and expresses his own views at times, which on the surface appears to undermine some of those policies. I'm not disputing that. I'll acknowledge that. But I come back to policies, and that's what our adversaries are primarily looking at, our policies.
But Article 5 does depend on our adversaries having absolute confidence that the President of the United States believes in NATO and in our commitment to defend every single ally, large or small, does it not? They have to believe that he believes it. Isn't that important?
Yeah, and in my view, I don't think there's an issue there. The United States will respond to an Article 5 incursion.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back. Well, unless you want to.
I agree with General Kane that the policies of this administration are like what Mark Twain said of Wagner's music, better than it sounds. But there's no substitute for presidential leadership. And I've said the same thing to Europeans that General Kane's been saying all over the world. Look what they do. They haven't done anything. The administration has not acted on the more problematic presidential statements. And I say it and I believe it, but I wish I didn't have to make that defense.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Chrissy Houlihan from Pennsylvania, and apologies to my colleague for skipping you in the last.
Not a problem at all. And thank you very much, Ambassadors in General, for coming today. My first question, sir, is for you, General. It has to do with the Russian military development and the recent realization that in 2018, the Russian defense spending actually went down, and for the first time Russia became one of the less than 5 highest people spending on DoD expenditures. And my question has to do with whether or not in doing this, you think that is Russia actually still a great power, or with the assessment now that there are great powers that are China and Russia, as they're declining in their expenditures, military expenditures, do you feel as though that's a reflection in their power and might, or is the fact that they're moving their expenditures into other areas, non-military areas, a reflection that they still continue to be a threat?
Well, it's a reflection of the economic challenges that Russia is facing in their country. As you know, they got significant inflation problems, unemployment problems, and the list goes on. But I spent over a year in a bipartisan congressional committee looking at principally where are we with Russia and China in terms of the national defense strategy. We are challenged by the fact that if we got involved in a confrontation in Europe, the United States is an ocean away and we have to move to that conflict. So that is a challenge in of itself. But I can flat tell you that Russia and China have both developed asymmetric capabilities. They haven't tried to build a force like ours, although China is building a navy like ours. But they have built asymmetric capabilities that have the capacity to take away something that we have always had dominance in, and that's the use of air power, not just from airplanes, but cruise missiles from ships. The Russians have that capability at Kaliningrad right now if we got involved in a conflict over the Baltics or in Poland, etc. So, yes, and Russia is a significant nuclear power. They have improved all of their strategic weapons, and we are just now getting around to putting some money in the budget to do that. And they have developing tactical nuclear weapons, as we know, in violation of the INF 1987 treaty. So yes, Russia has significant military capability to this day that can impose cost on the United States and our allies in a conventional conflict. Likely, that's not what they want to do, because hybrid warfare operating below the level of that conflict has proven to be geopolitically successful for them.
And sir, where are they failing? If they're succeeding in those areas that you just outlined, where is Russia failing?
Well, Russia has a conscript military, and they only really professionalized about 30 to 40% of it. And their conscripts stay for 1 year, and therefore their morale isn't what it should be, their leadership isn't what it should be, and 2/3 of that military. So I'm not about hyping the threat. I'm about trying to be realistic about what it is and what is likely. But there's no doubt when you put a microscope on it that Russia does have a capability to impose cost on us in a conventional war. Over time, we win that war. But initially, it's significant.
And that's my final question, which is, given the expenditures that we are making in terms of dollars and given their capabilities and their weaknesses, do you feel as though we are collectively gaining ground on Russia or losing ground?
Our problem is Russia and China have caught us technology-wise where we had a significant technological advantage for years. So they've got precision-guided munitions, stealth technology, electronic warfare. The list goes on and on and on, where we had dominance over them. We don't have that kind of dominance now, and what we're trying to do with the Trump defense buildup is get the kind of dominance and parity that we're used to having, for one reason only. That capability, just like the capability we had during the Cold War, prevents war. And that's what we want to do. We want to make certain that the erosion that we've experienced, why? 17 years of 9/11 wars, budget reduction and sequestration, particularly the latter, kneecapped us rather significantly. And this is close to 2 decades now of impact on military capability. The Trump defense buildup, I think, is more critical than actually the Reagan defense buildup, given the adversaries that we're facing and what their capabilities are. We can't do it just for 1 or 2 years, Madam. We've got to do it for about 5 or 6 years to get back to where we have a credible deterrence.
I appreciate it. I know that my time is up. I guess the bigger part of my question is why, with $700+ billion every year, or increasingly every year, we are still behind or not spending our money appropriately so that we can counter those asymmetrical threats?
Well, you answered the question. Some of that money has not been spent appropriately, and I hope as we're going forward that we're really focused on what capabilities. You know, just give you one example. If a military service is taking a legacy system and they're going to want to improve that legacy system that's going to be with us for the next 20 or 30 years, wrong decision. Why is that? because we have artificial intelligence coming, we have quantum sensors coming, we have directive energy coming that our opponents are all going to have. We got to get up on that next technological edge is where we have to be, and not spend money on systems that fought a war in the past and is not going to fight a war in the future.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I promise. I'm sorry for going over my time. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Trone from Maryland.
Good afternoon. We're almost finished. First, I want to thank you guys for your excellent responses to Mr. Malinowski's questions. I thought that was very helpful and really appreciate your candor. Thank you. Russia appears to be fomenting conflict along its border region, the West, in order to block any chance of NATO accession to NATO. I'm thinking specifically about Georgia, Moldova. Regardless whether NATO should seek to expand in those countries, do you believe the NATO alliance should tolerate such behavior from Russia? And if not, what can NATO do to counteract it? Who wants to take a stab?
I think we have, across multiple administrations and with the help of the Congress, worked hard to strengthen those leaders in Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, and it has not been monolithic in any of those countries who seek more democratic, open, tolerant societies. We have also worked hard to push back against Russian militarization of parts of those countries. I think the question now is whether, even absent the parts of those countries that are occupied, if you will, or under foreign influence, is the rest of the country, whether it's Georgia, whether it's Moldova, whether it's Ukraine, are they meeting the highest standards that we demand of NATO members? And I think our goal now should be to work with each of them to make clear that it's not about the pieces of territory that they've lost. It's about whether they are clean enough, strong enough, democratic enough to be in our family. And frankly, we've also got NATO members where we've got a problem there.
Agreed. We've seen Russia invest significant resources expanding its influence in Central Europe and the Balkans. President Putin has a like-minded ally now in NATO, in the EU, and Viktor Orban in Hungary. He's testing NATO unity in Turkey and continues to make inroads in Siberia, to your point. Are you concerned that President Putin is establishing an alliance of illiberal autocrats in Europe? And to what extent does this rollback of democracy in some places underline the transatlantic alliance?
I think President Putin will seek out autocrats on principle, but his interference in European elections goes far beyond. I mean, Russians were involved in Spain's Catalonia referendum. They were involved, as it turns out, in Brexit. They will work everywhere they can looking for opportunities to divide. I do think that they have an inclination toward hard right nationalism, but they'll go with any extremist, right or left. I think that Putin is able to do this. That is, he's able to try to assemble an international alliance of autocrats and nationalists partly because the United States has stepped back from its leadership of the free world. And I don't mean just this administration, though I mean that too, but even in the last administration, we did not seem to be stepping up in to our traditional role. It's tough. The United States gets hit when we lead, but when we don't lead, things are worse. And I think that the fallout from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and American war weariness and economic problems at home have tended to weaken the national consensus for American leadership abroad. I think it will take a lot of effort to maintain that. I think it's important. I think both American political parties have strong traditions of supporting international leaders, but isolationism or kind of inward-looking unilateralism and nationalism also has a tradition in American politics. I wish it didn't, but it does. And I think that ultimately is the answer to Putinism. We need to step up and remember our best traditions and who we are.
Well said. What about the yellow vests? Is he part of that mess in France?
I think that the Russians go for anybody willing to play their game. I think what they do in our country, which is take socially divisive issues and play both sides to exacerbate it, they will play in every European country where they can. I think the players change, that is their tools change, but their tactics are the same.
Sounds like a yes. I yield back. Thank you.
I would just say it bears investigating where their funding is coming from.
Yeah.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Congressman Andy Levin from Michigan.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you all for coming in today. I know there's been some focus on Russia's activities in Ukraine, and I want to go back there a little bit and explore in more detail. Brookings fellow Alina Polyakova wrote that while Russian interference in Western elections came as a surprise to many, Russia has a long track record of intervening in Ukraine's elections since 2004. Ukraine's experience is thus a bellwether for assessing the Russian tactics that may be deployed against the West. Ms. Newland, can you share a bit more about the kinds of tactics that we've seen from Russia with respect to Ukrainian elections, and what, if any, Russian interference did we see during or in the lead up to the recent presidential elections?
The traditional Russian playbook in Ukraine had been less about influence campaigns on Ukrainian voters and more about support along with the oligarchs who are in their orbit of individual candidates who they thought would be more favorable to Russia's interests, its economic interests, and its military interests. So to try to squeeze out Democrats and when they come into office to damage them, to hurt them with the electorate, and in the case of Yushchenko, actually throw acid on his face, and there were some vicious things that went on. The interesting thing about these elections is that the mandate, the margin by which President-elect Zelensky won was so massive that any manipulation that may or may not have been by anybody got swamped by the people's will. I think the question now, Zelensky said a lot of the right things about anti-corruption and about breaking the oligarchic system in Ukraine, but he himself has been in business with senior oligarchic figures. So he's got to now prove it, and we should support him if he does, but we should tie our assistance to a cleaner, more democratic, more economically open Ukraine.
What do you and others think about the role of independent media in Ukraine, and whether the U.S. could play a helpful role there in supporting the growth of independent media as part of that broadening you're talking about?
We have done a considerable amount to offer training. I think it's very important that foreign media not be controlled by us, but be indigenous. The problem has been that there's so much oligarchic money, not just in Ukraine, but throughout Central Europe as well, in the media space, the owning of television stations, et cetera, that it's very hard for independent journalists to survive and thrive. So support for independent journalism, training, solidarity with them, protection of them is very important.
My reaction in watching Russia, certainly meddling in elections is clearly is part of their foreplay, so to speak. But when it comes to Ukraine, it wasn't too long ago when their stooge was running the country. And clearly and the reason why he's no longer running the country, obviously, is the impasse of Ukraine looking for the West, looking for economic ties with Europe in particular, and eventually in a political military alliance with NATO. So what I see Putin influencing more in the country is pushing back on the domestic reforms that are necessary to gain economic viability and political stability as a result of that, because that's clearly not in his interest. So oligarchs are a part of that. Flushing money in there is a part of all of that, and the obvious corruption. Even the Kurt Strait issue, while the focus was certainly on naval-to-naval issue, what he was really interfering with is economically the ports that to the north of the Kerch Straits and the transit of commodities out of those ports is what
All right,
is interfering.
let me try to shoehorn one more question in, really about the application of the tactics to the U.S. Last week, the New York Times reported that the White House Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, instructed former Homeland Security Secretary Christy Nielsen not to talk about Russian election interference around the president because, quote, Mr. Trump still equated any public discussion of malign Russian election activity with questions about the legitimacy of his victory. Consequently, according to the Times, the issue did not gain the urgency or widespread attention that a president can command, and it meant that many Americans remain unaware of the latest Russian versions of interference. Do any of you want to comment about whether it's fair to say that until the president acknowledges the facts about Russia's interference in our elections and mobilizes the defenses we'll need to counter that interference, we'll remain vulnerable to those attacks?
I think one of the themes from this panel has been that presidential leadership is critical. And as someone who, like Ambassador Nuland, did a lot of crafting talking points for secretaries and even presidents, vice presidents, it shouldn't be that hard to speak about the policy challenge of Russian election interference and disinformation without getting into the more difficult and partisan issues of the Mueller report. It's not that hard, or it shouldn't be that hard. Presidential leadership is crucial. Acknowledging the facts of Russian attempted election interference can be separated from the partisan question and even the political question of the actual 2016 campaign. You could put it aside, draw a thick line, and say, okay, this is what we have to do to prevent it. And there is a viable set of toolkits. I mean, there's a consensus emerging among policy experts about how to deal with disinformation. Cyber experts know what they're doing. The level of knowledge is well ahead of the political ability to sustain it into presidential level policy, I think.
All right, well, I really appreciate the chairwoman and now the chairman's tolerance, because I've gone over my time, but I really appreciate your answer. And I mean, it really is a question of the integrity of our democracy. So I agree it goes above all politics and above all partisanships. Thanks, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Allred.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ambassadors in general for being here today. I think I am likely your last questioner, so congratulations. Before seeking this office, I was a voting rights attorney, and one of the things that we were always concerned with was, of course, methods of state voter suppression, but also of conditions that might cause people not to vote, lack of confidence in our system, belief that their vote doesn't matter, and of course, misinformation. And I know we've had a lot of discussion about Russian interference in the 2016 election today. Ambassador Fried, I wanted to ask you about what we can do in our civil society, our media, our social media, our people, to prepare ourselves and to perhaps inoculate ourselves for 2020. Because I visited the NSA. I think there's been some pretty accurate public reporting about what Russia's efforts were in the 2018 election and how they were interrupted. And I think we can obviously anticipate more in 2020. What do you think we can do in our civil society to prepare ourselves for this?
Let me focus on one aspect of it. I expect that Russians, but maybe others, will use social media to disinform and misinform potential voters. Stuff like polling places aren't open, or changing the address of polling places, or you have to bring this or that document with you, and if you don't, you'll be arrested. There'll be all kinds of garbage out there. The way to fight that, or one way to fight that, is to get in place in advance civil society groups, activists who can expose this misinformation, and then link them up with reliable and trusted local community leaders, and have a kind of a war room set up to respond to exposed misinformation and disinformation in real time, and then get the word out to people what to ignore. Now, that's hard. The bad guys are always going to be faster, but we shouldn't allow that kind of disinformation to go unchallenged. And the time to set that stuff up is now and raise people's awareness. It can be the Russians, it can be various extremists. They're going to be in that space. And the Russians love voter suppression because they want to exacerbate our existing social divisions. So this is, it's whatever the source, there are tools available to fight it, and you don't have to go through, it doesn't require a federal government program. Local activists can do it, but you need tech-savvy people who can expose it, and then you need to link them with community leaders that have credibility.
Thank you so much. And I want to point to something you wrote in your written testimony. You said the United States was different from previous great powers, exceptional, if you will, because we understood that our nation would do well when and only when other nations also did well. We were not interested in merely guarding a sphere of influence like the great powers of the past. Instead, in a breathtaking display of confidence and vision, we understood that we could make the world a better place and do well for ourselves in the process. I want to finish just by commending that and saying that I could not agree more. I think that our values, and as I think you've talked about with other questioners, leading with our values is important in terms of our response to Russia. And if you could just finish by maybe summarizing some of your thoughts there.
Well, thank you for recalling that. I believe that strongly. I learned the key professional experience in my career was the overthrow of communism and the successful replacement of it by democratic governments. And that taught me something about what we used to call the American way. So I do have what sounds like a naive faith in the power of the best American ideals to overcome the darker sides of our tradition. And I still have that faith.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. Learned a lot, and I really appreciate all of your testimony today.
Thank you, Mr. Allred. It's that time of the now late afternoon when I can thank the three of you for truly excellent testimony. And you can see by the level of participation that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle think so too. We had so many people come here and participate and ask questions. So I just want to thank you. I know I've learned a lot. And I want to just thank you, three of you, for all you do. And it was a pleasure listening to you. I think you made so many excellent points that I think it gives a lot of us on this committee pause for thought. And thank you so much. And the hearing is now adjourned.